Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the sixth Sociology and Anthropology undergraduate conference with the theme Resisting, Redefining, Reclaiming Stories of Struggle and Change. This conference is organized by the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Ateneo de Manila University. I am Art, and I am the facilitator for the afternoon session. Without further ado, we now invite the first group for the afternoon session. Their research is titled Gotta Go My Own Way, Narrative of Learning Home Among Metro Manila-based Filipino Gen Z Women by Micaela Isabel R. Evangelista, Fatima Hane Hosine, and Shara Ernestine E. Valencia. Their supervisor is Ms. Mayflor Pag-asa A. Quinones. Same as this morning, each group is given 20 minutes for the presentation and another 15 minutes for the interpellation with the panelists.
Imagine standing at the threshold of your own space for the very first time. No family to greet you when you get home, no familiar voices echoing throughout the halls, just silence. And yet, within that silence, there's an exhilarating hum of endless possibilities, an opportunity to redefine who you are and what you can become. For many young women, leaving the home is a profound step toward independence and self-discovery. But what exactly pushes these women to move out and live independently? And how does it challenge long-standing notions about family and the roles of women? We started wondering about these questions when we noticed more young Filipino vloggers sharing their experiences of living alone online. What started as curiosity then grew into a deeper exploration as our study set out to understand these motivations, meanings, and experiences of leaving home among Gen Z women. Good afternoon, everyone. We are Kiara Valencia, Fatima Hanay Husseini, and Micaela Evangelista. Thank you for your presence in our thesis presentation titled Gotta Go My Own Way, Narratives of Leaving Home Among Metro Manila-Based Filipino Generation Z Women. Before we begin, we would like to express our deepest gratitude to those who have guided and supported us throughout this journey. We extend our sincerest thanks to our thesis advisor, Ms. Mapes Quinones, whose guidance has been instrumental in shaping this research. We would also like to thank our panelists and reviewers present today, Ma'am Tricia Reyes and Dr. Glenda Wee. Your time, expertise, and insights are truly appreciated. And we would also like to thank Dr. Andrea Socoroda for her insights and guidance during the early stages of our study. So, our presentation will proceed as follows, beginning with the background, followed by the conceptual framework, methodology, our findings and analysis, and the conclusion. So to give a brief background on the central elements of our study, let's start with Filipino Gen Z. Born between 1997 and 2012, Gen Z is often described as digital natives with a strong focus on identity formation, autonomy, and authenticity. The older members of this generation, now in emerging adulthood, are at a stage where they explore their identities and seek greater independence, particularly from their parents. Maybe for some of you Gen Z here, can relate to this. It is during this phase that many emerging adults begin moving out or leaving home as a way to foster their independence. However, for Filipino Gen Z, despite their individualistic values, family remains a core part of their lives, which leads them to navigate a complex balance between self-focus and familial duty. When it comes to home leaving, Filipino women's experiences are shaped by gendered migration patterns, familial responsibilities, and economic necessity. For many middle-class Filipino women, leaving home is also an act of agency, shaped by both cultural and economic forces. And the decision to leave home is also highly contingent on social norms and expectations, which vary across different communities and regions. Metro Manila, meanwhile, has long been a prime destination for migration and a symbol of opportunity and power in the Philippines. Since the 1960s, it has drawn migrants from across the country, especially from rural provinces, in pursuit of better economic prospects. As a long-standing center of commerce, politics, and culture, Manila shapes the aspirations of many individuals who choose to leave home and seek opportunities, new experiences, and independence beyond familial expectations. Now, while home leaving in the Philippines has been widely studied, much of the focus is on outward migration and its economic dimensions. This leaves an opening for studies that focus on the cultural, symbolic, and social aspects of home leaving, especially among Filipino Gen Z women. The study also inserts itself into the opening of a need for more localized studies, as existing comprehensive research on Gen Z and home leaving are often based in international contexts and doesn't zero into the experiences of Gen Z women. By centering the voices of Filipino Gen Z women, this study intends to provide a more nuanced, context-specific understanding of this practice and their experiences of it. Now, our study is guided by the following research questions. First, what social interactions and influences shape Filipino Gen Z women's motivations and decisions to leave their family households? The second is, how do Filipino Gen Z women interpret or make meanings from living with and away from their families within the context of extant social norms and cultural expectations? And in what ways does home leaving serve to negotiate agency and autonomy within Gen Z's women's socio-cultural context?
So we'd like to apologize first. It looks like the PowerPoint is an outdated version, but we will proceed with as follows. So to answer the previously mentioned research questions, we employ this conceptual framework. We initially had 3 theories, which tried to tie the phenomenon back to a more ambitious macro view of changing values in the Philippines. But after feedback from our panelists during the proposal, and in light of the data that actually emerged, we decided to bring the theory back to a more symbolic level, looking at norms and meanings within respective families, how these are reworked by the individual as they step out of the unit, and what goals or projects are formed as a result of this reworking. That said, the study uses an integrated framework of Berger and Luckman's theory of social construction and Sherry Ortner's concept of agency to make sense of the norms and meanings that social actors, or in this case, women who leave the home, navigate and negotiate. What is highlighted here are Berger and Luckman's concepts of objective and subjective reality, along with the tripartite process of externalization, objectivation, and internalization. On the other hand, Ortner's agency here is identified as the ways these women play by or with culturally constituted rules with skill, intention, knowledge, and intelligence. Moreover, Ortner's agency of projects, mentioned below, refers to the ways these women seek to accomplish valued things within a framework of their own categories of value. Put together, we trace this sequence. The Filipino Gen Z woman in the study is primarily socialized within the family unit, where a set of norms, meanings, or rules exist. The dialogic process of internalization and agency, where the individual confronts the effects of their socialization, produces a subjective understanding of reality and of one's categories of value. The woman is not just passive in this process, as her practices may reproduce or go against the rules set out for her. These reformed values and meanings, therefore, become constructive of the goals or projects set by these individuals. This combined framework, therefore, tries to make sense of the socialization of Filipino Gen Z women within their respective homes, how home leaving fits within the set of rules within the family, how home leaving facilitates their practice of agency, what meanings are created or recreated through these experiences, how these meanings form projects, and perhaps to tie it back together, how this recalibrated individual reality of the agentic daughter also makes its way back into the family unit.
Now moving on to the methodology. So detailed on the slide are the qualifications that we have identified for study eligibility. So these were also included in our online screening survey, a Google form that collated responses from interested individuals, which we often kept checking. The poster on the right was created for sharing on Facebook and Instagram, which are social media platforms often used by thesis groups to search for participants of the study. And yes, so next, sorry. Yes, okay. Okay, yes. This is an outdated version of the PowerPoint, but we will continue. Yes, so the data gathering process was conducted through semi-structured interviews to encourage participants to share their experiences more freely and to allow sort of the data to emerge on its own. We interviewed 9 Gen Z Filipino women through hybrid modalities, 6 of which were conducted online through Zoom and 3 in person. The questionnaire that guided the interview was divided into 6 sections that explored a range of topics that range from family dynamics to the experience and practice of independence. At the end of the conversation, participants were able to choose their own pseudonyms.
So for our scope and limitations, again, our study focuses on Gen Z women aged 23 to 27 years old. Our scope highlights specifically the experiences of unmarried women who are living independently in Metro Manila, meaning either they live alone or with non-romantic and non-relative companions. We initially planned to interview 10 participants and conduct 2 expert interviews for data triangulation. However, due to time constraints, we narrowed the participants to 9 and omitted the expert interviews. Despite these changes, however, the insights from the 9 participants still provided rich and substantial findings.
Okay. So with this, we have chalked up our findings to 5 themes that reflect the motivations of home living, the process of meaning making, and the exercise of autonomy demonstrated by Gen Z Filipino women.
So our research participants, as you can see on the presentation, are women aged 23 to 25, with most of them being 23 years old. They've been living independently for anywhere between 6 months to 5 years. While most of them consider themselves middle to upper class, they come from different geographic and socio-cultural contexts, especially for those emerging from Iloilo, Cagayan, and even Dubai, which gives us a range of perspectives and varied experiences despite this homogeneity in social class. Now let's dive into their stories as we move on to the findings and analysis.
Okay, so our first theme that we identified was motivations for and drivers of home living. So some factors that contributed to the participants' motivation to leave home included socioeconomic mobility and aspirations, gaining autonomy, and self-actualization. These factors were the ones that fueled their decision to leave home to pursue 1, broader opportunities in Metro Manila, and 2, to escape familial expectations. So when we talk about broader opportunities, we're referring to, or this includes career or educational paths as well as just new experiences in general. So Okay, so Joy perceived living independently as a transitory phase or stepping stone towards the goal of pursuing further education abroad. On the other hand, Yang sought opportunities beyond Iloilo, saying that there was more than this, there was more than her small hometown. And as part of her definition of home living, she notes that living independently meant trying new experiences, which during our conversation, she told Kiara, Tommy, and I to try for ourselves if we ever had the means to live independently. So we'll update you on that. For Petunia, who originated from Cagayan de Oro, she likened herself to a fish that has outgrown her pond and felt it necessary to move on to bigger waters, saying that it was time for her to adapt. As for the second general sort of motivation for escaping familial expectations, the pandemic made Jelly first realize how staying in Iloilo and her strained relationship with her family contributed to her emotional distress and trauma. However, now that she enjoys living independently now, even something as small as being able to choose what she'd wear and not having her mom tell her to change was a sense of freedom that Jelly found in independent living. On the other hand, Gab wanted to distance herself from her toxic family environment, where conflicts between her mother and her grandmother would often ensue and create an overwhelming environment. And so this lack of personal space that she experienced, which was evidenced by her sharing a bedroom with 2 or 3 family members, coupled with the undiagnosed mental health struggles at the time, further motivated her to leave. And so it is noteworthy to point out that all the participants that were detailed in the table previously have identified to belong to the middle socioeconomic class, which to some extent informs their capability to leave home. However, despite coming from various origins, as seen from the table, their experiences within the family unit that influenced their decision to leave home were very similar. Another common attribute that most of the participants shared were that they were also eldest daughters in the family. And they echoed similar sentiments on how this position in their family came with deeply internalized responsibilities and norms that were both shaped by gender and birth order. Those like Carolina and Gab found themselves acting as mediators between their parents and younger siblings, and even acting as the latter's caretakers and providers. So the implications of leaving their former responsibility and pursuing independence then was something difficult for them to depart from because of just how integral they were or the role that they played in their family. For Gen Z women in the study, leaving home to pursue broader opportunities is not always a radical departure from familial norms, but may at times be an extension of them, which is a very interesting point that surfaced from our conversations. It reflects Ortner's idea of agency that asserts that agentic practice is not merely opposing institutional forces one has grown up with, but rather operating as a product of them. And as Yang aptly noted, it begs the question of how you can engage with what you were taught and what you were taught growing up. In Filipino, binabaon ba natin ang tinuturo sa amin? Berger and Luckman's social construction theory enriches women's exercise of agency in home living by underscoring their intentions to undertake a more independent role that is not contingent on familial expectations or norms that have been socially produced. So for our second sort of theme in that centers around shared meanings of home living, participants also echoed common definitions and implications of this. Aside from the literal aspect of moving out with all the boxes and the logistics of it, they also highlighted the significance of the emotional weight of the act of leaving and departing from home. The way these experiences were manifested are grounded in the participants' upbringing within their respective families that uphold various norms, values, and expectations. To serve as an example, one of our questions during the interview were asking participants about the roles that they continue to fulfill despite living apart from their families. And notably, one participant also included the roles that she had to let go of as a result of independent living. This line of questioning was informed by the idea that language served as a tool to reinforce particular norms and conveying socially constructed meanings embedded within these roles. So this participant was Carolina, and her explanation of her role as a student and as a daughter demonstrates this point, as meanings that she attached to being a student and being a daughter are of varying levels with their respective demands. So exercising independence is not just being completely self-reliant, but an integration of autonomy and meaningful activity, valued roles, and a continuity of identity. This circles back to the idea that home living and its independent aspect is not just the mere physical leaving of home, but also the emotional connections participants had to loosen with family and community in order for them to live without needing to adhere to past expectations. Leaving home really means you are uprooting everything in a manner na di ka na babalik, in a way that you're not going to return home. And this is what Petunia states when she was asked about her definition of home leaving. The decision to not move back, even when ridden with feelings of homesickness or missing your family or longing for family, longing for a familiar environment, is one that the participants were very definite about. And Gab echoes this by saying that in spite of missing her family, it never came to a point where she wanted to move back home. In line with Berger and Luckman's notion of subjective reality, the meanings attached to home leaving are informed by an individual's social background, with familial norms and meanings assigned to embodied roles, shaping how independence is interpreted and pursued.
All right, thanks for keeping up with us despite the technical difficulties. In a way to train your brain from the, short form video attention span issue today. So yes, I hope you guys stay with us. The next theme is the negotiation of familial expectations, which covers the practices and strategies employed by some of the participants to avoid friction with their families. For instance, if you're a dormer texting your parents, you probably have hidden a few details from them, right? Like how late you stay out or how far exactly you're going. Gawain ko na rin yan. This is exactly what the participants in the study mentioned doing. But aside from the participants' concealment of these details, they also mentioned having to somehow play the older sister role, even from afar, usually by offering emotional support to siblings through texts or calls. This theme also includes notions of utang na loob as well, which have persisted among some participants even after leaving the home. A 2017 study by Cabalquinto discusses how transnational families, Filipino families, use the mobile phone as a tool for the continued performance of familial roles. The mediation of familial roles, like being a sister or having familial obligations, also demonstrate a form of doing family, which is prominent in migration studies to refer to how migrants perform familial roles that reinstitute the family even across borders. Through mediated family interactions, the rules of the home peek through even at a distance, and these women play around them in order to reduce potential conflicts. In this sense, familial rules are never fully abandoned, even if they become easier to deviate from. Ortner's agency, again, manifests in these projects as these women continue to navigate rules in order to continue pursuing the projects that they've constituted. The third identified theme looks at how home leaving carves out a space for identity formation and self-discovery. I'm sure one way or another, we all have experiences of having to operate within the borders lined out by the family unit. At home, this is how you should act. This is what we're gonna eat for lunch or dinner. This is what we're gonna do today. The family's voice is very pronounced. This is why, for most of these women, leaving home allowed them to discover and become more of themselves. For them, home leaving facilitated the development of an identity beyond the family's influence. By no longer having to consider their family in certain decisions, these women gained the space to both reflect on and live out values, beliefs, and goals. For the women in this study, home leaving enabled them to agentically reevaluate learned norms and values. Moreover, this learning process is reinforced by the active pursuit of projects constructed through these negotiated meaning systems. Learning about what they want to prioritize, what their goals are, and working to actually set these in motion. For instance, staying out of the family home because they want to live out their preferred lifestyle. This is a demonstration of agency as these women enact their own culturally constituted projects. Under the final theme, changing family relationships amid the distance, participants talk about how the space wedged by family by leaving the home led to less daily tensions and allowed the distance to make the heart grow fonder. For some, the lack of friction led to healthier relationships, and moving out also became a learned lesson for the family. And the self-development that came with moving out also allowed them to teach and prompt change for their parents. Again, this provides an opportunity for the agentic Gen Z woman and her reworked individual reality to reintroduce newer meanings to the family's objective reality, returning to and tying Berger and Luckman's social construction process.
So, I guess to keep things short, we can switch to the next. So overall, our findings revealed that motivations for leaving home varied greatly for young Gen Z women, from pursuing greater opportunities and seeking independence to distancing themselves from familial expectations. For Filipino Gen Z women, leaving home also meant a redefinition of self and a challenge to take ownership of their lives. Through the lens of social construction and agency, we observed how these women navigate enduring family dynamics and redefine personal identities. Amidst their varied narratives, a common thread among the women emerged, and that is leaving home is an imperative step to finding, forging, and going their own way. That concludes our presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Micaela Isabel, Fatima, and Ernestine, Shara Ernestine. We now invite our esteemed panel members, such as Dr. Maria Glenda Wee and Ms. Rosel Tricia Reyes Carbaja. We begin with Ms. Trish, who is joining online through Zoom.
Ayan. Hi everyone! Hello! Nandito po ako ngayon sa... Hi po! Pasensya na for not being there physically, but I'd like to congratulate the team, the group, no, for your presentation. And I've been with you since your proposal defense, so nakakatuwang makita kung ano na yung nangyari afterwards. So, congrats and thank you, Miss Mapes. I'm here. I'm here for you! Sige, firstly, maganda yung topic. It's a good topic. It's a very interesting topic. But what I really, of course, I've scanned through your draft. No, I would just wanna reiterate, no, to highlight and be consistent, no, throughout your manuscript, because that's very important. Because there's a lot of parts wherein sayang, no, kung nandoon na yung drive or I mean yung conversations, no, na matuloy-tuloy siya up to the end para talagang mas malinaw siya, no. But more importantly, siguro ang gusto ko lang ma-highlight, no, talaga is the values and priorities of these individuals that you were able to talk to. Because what I noticed is that aside from that fact that they are 9 sila, no? 7 of them are eldest children and then 2 only child. So may malaking factor kasi yun kung bakit kaya mas motivated sila, bakit kaya mas gear towards leaving home yung mga individuals na ito. Because that's very interesting in that kind of setup. No? So yun yung isang magandang napansin ko doon. But another thing is that kaya ko nabanggit yung values is because I noticed also there's a lot of individuals there who have lived in a different country, who have studied in a different country, and even studied locally. Pero kumbaga, even in high school, na-experience na nila. Because that's also a value setting within their family, no, that they are somehow allowing them, or parang it's a norm already in their household kung bakit yun yung actually, nakita ko rin dun sa manuscript nyo na one of your interviewee ay yung aunt nila, yung family members nila, nag-move out din naman. So, kumbaga, surrounded sila of that kind of experience. Siguro that's one, I think, an important thing, no, that maybe you check out what their values are, connect them to their motivations and priorities per se, kasi yung iba, they're studying, they want to focus to studying, they want to focus on their work without any other responsibilities and whatnot. And yun, yes, definitely we can see how they were able to practice their agency through that. But then again, siguro yung pinakahuli kong while you were presenting and afterwards, no, ang question na underlying sa akin ngayon is, okay, that's their motivation. You've analyzed that for this Generation Z. Ano kaya yung difference nila sa ibang generations? I mean, I'm a millennial. And I think a lot of those could be similar to my colleagues' reasons, no, for leaving home. Ngayon tuloy parang nandun ako sa thought na anong difference? I mean, after learning that and all, ano ba yung Gen Z um, particularity that we can actually put on the conversation? Parang, baby, baka may something kayo in mind para lang may kono tayo. Na parang makakasabi na, oh, Gen Z to, kaya ito yung living home nila. Ganyan.
Siguro one difference po of Gen Zs as compared to millennials is that for them, there's really a motivation or a drive to go beyond structural confines or to challenge structural confines. And there's this value, although I guess there's this value among Gen Z that they're the way they determine their life, it's something that they seek. It's not something that's given to them. So, or it's not something that they just accept. So they really pursue, whether it's through home leaving or through other practices, they really pursue this definition of the self. They or how they forge their identities. They pursue it in a way that's determined by them, and yeah, not being confined to structural aspects. But
Alright. Sige, go.
Hello. So if I may just address the first two concerns regarding eldest daughters, if I remember correctly, and yung norm naman na yung independence dun sa kanilang families. That's actually, on the second point, that is, there is a subtopic within our findings that talks about that, although we'll work to communicate it better, regarding normativity within the family. So we did mention there, kasi initially in the proposal, and I remember this very clearly, Doc Andy told us that it's not necessarily a deviation to leave home. It's not necessarily a deviation from existing norms. It's always contingent on the family. And it's exactly why we reframed our research questions to look particularly into respective families rather than painting broad strokes. Kasi nga, totoo naman, within our 9 women that we interviewed, only one actually mentioned that she felt that it was a huge deviation from her family. For the rest, there were people who paved the way. There were other parang mobile women naman in their families. So it is mentioned there. And again, we will probably work on communicating that better and more clearly. It's mentioned there that hindi naman siya deviation talaga kasi, especially for them, a lot of them were actually raised to be independent. They say themselves na they themselves don't feel like they're deviating from a norm. In fact, for some, they feel like they're performing independence kasi yun yung norm sa kanila. So yeah, that is something, again, we'll work towards maybe communicating better in the manuscript. Thank you as well for pointing that out. Regarding eldest daughters naman, interestingly, it wasn't something we sought out in our study. Like when we were looking for participants, we weren't necessarily saying dapat eldest daughter. It wasn't part of the inclusion criteria, but that's what emerged. But at the same time, there wasn't a lot. There were only a few who mentioned that they felt that they had still obligations towards their family that were strong. Kasi, of course, eldest daughter in an Asian family, in an Asian household, that has clear implications already. But only one, for instance, as the eldest daughter, feels that she's still obliged to financially support her family. And then for others, they feel like they play the older sister role, but to a lesser degree. So, although we did mention it, I think it's also something that can still be much more nuanced, for instance, by class, by other capacities that they have. For instance, and we were going to mention this in the conclusion, it's quite a homogeneous sample in terms of class. So a lot of them identify as middle class. Only one who said lower middle class, pero middle class pa din siya. So those sort of capacities nuance, I think as well, the obligations that eldest daughters have or feel that they have. Although I think, again, we can work on highlighting that idea, especially on eldest daughters, especially if existing literature are already there. We'll attempt to focus on that as well. But thank you for your comments. Ma'am Trish, if you have any more recommendations or
Yeah, okay. Thank you for answering. And actually, both of your answers have contributed to that question ng ano ba yung difference from other generations. Kasi yung lang obligations na yun, number one, being eldest, like iba na, di ba, yung obligations nila as eldest children or only child even, no? And yung nabanggit mo na they were raised to be independent, which is an important aspect also, which again, like what I initially mentioned, you can highlight, parang maganda talaga na mas ma-highlight nyo siya that way. Kasi ang maganda naman yung flow, maganda yung questions, and tama din naman yung sinabi ni Doc Andy, it's not really a deviation. Especially in that generation, I'd like siguro, no, other than other older generations, no? So, yun. Yun lang. Yung other technicality, si Doc Glenda na po yung bahala.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Ms.
for your comments.
Thank you, Ms. Trish. Dr. Glenda is currently attending an event for the Philippine Sociology Roadmap. She will just send you her comments and suggestions. And of course, Ms. May, your supervisor, is here with us. So I think Dr. Glenda has already sent her comments and suggestions. All right.
Sige. Alright. Sige, thank you. I have a phone-in message from Doc Glenn's phone. Very, very, of course, thank you, Ma'am Trish. We appreciate your comments, and we appreciate that you showed up. It's really women showing up for women, which, you know, it's just something that you demonstrated today. Congratulations to these girls. Di ba? Na parang, okay, na, you went your own way, even, you know, even through the technical difficulties. So I'm really very proud of you guys. Okay, may comments rin ako. But you know, I would like to read the comments from from Dr. Glenda, who is again in facilitating a workshop in Mindanao State University in Iligan. So what she says here, for her general comment, the thesis is generally well written, right? However, there are areas that can be improved. You should create an abstract, number one, discussing your research questions, methodology, analysis and findings, and conclusion. Number two, you discuss the following topics for the literature review. How do the theories discussed in the literature review come together as you analyze your research problems? You should not only enumerate and discuss them, but you should also be able to show how the concepts and theories you discussed help you better analyze the variables you are going to analyze and address the research questions. So these are the elements. Gen Z as emerging adults, navigating identity formation and values development, digital native, social media influence on identity, decision making, and aspirations, the history and transformation of the Filipino family structure, home living and the implication of migration. So the different topics that you covered. Home living across cultures, home living and education, home living and personal autonomy, home living as class-based, Berger and Luckman's seminal work, The Social Construction of Reality, and Ortner's Theorization of Agency. Okay? And then third, you should put into your conceptual framework the variables you want to study and how these relate with each other. The variables you want to study should be based on your research questions. So it's really just putting everything in together, all right? And then here, so for the fourth, and this is something that she would like you to answer right now, what is the most important finding of your research and why?
Okay, I think I can start off with that question. I think the most important one, at least the one that we thought was the idea of normativity. After all, we moved towards, we began this research with the idea of a macro level of norms that exist within the Filipino family, but we moved toward a more micro level of norms and meanings. And so the actual norms and normativity that emerged in the experiences of the participants was something that I think for us, we found it to be among the most important, if not the most important, because I think that also highlights other things like capacities, other contextual factors in norms. And so yeah, how they not just deviate, but also how they produce and stick to norms, and again how they work around and rework or again reproduce these norms is something that is quite emergent, at least in the data, and is also really what the basis of the conceptual framework and the theory is from the idea of norms, how the norms within families are produced, how they're reproduced, what they take and what they don't take, and then that pulls it back down to the idea of subjectivity and being agentic. Kasi what are they being agentic about? It's really also the norms.
I guess another significant finding is in relation to Arnett's emerging adulthood, because in the way Arnett conceptualized emerging adulthood, he states that this is a time or a life stage for young people wherein individuals are free from social roles and norms. Through our findings, we can see that for Filipino Gen Z women at this stage, in the age of 18 to 29 years old, or rather 23 to 25, even at this life stage where there should be a focus on independence, and they are pursuing this independence through home living, you can still see how integral the role of the family is, and how embedded it is within their practices, within their values. And so in a way, our study contextualizes emerging adulthood within the Philippine context, wherein these emerging adults, these Gen Z emerging adults, are not really free from social roles and these norms. So yeah, that's one.
Sorry, last na, kasi mahaba na. Yeah, I think in line with what Tommy and Karev mentioned about norms, one of the salient findings, or something that when we were conversing na parang na epiphany ako, but more of like how pursuing opportunities, because that was what we thought also, because one of our aspects of the study that we thought would be emergent, like really emergent, was the role of social media and how that influences them to sort of pursue living independently. But it's not that. Parang there was a lot of, again, focus on familial norms and how it's not really going against what their family has taught them. It's not that they were spiteful or like they were harboring like negative emotions because of how they were brought up, really, but it was more of an extension. And I think that was one of the things that one of our participants mentioned, na parang they're acting in a way that sort of transforms the values that they have learned in their family, and how they've sort of how they were able to live that out in their own way, in their own independent space. So yeah, like conversing with these women was really, like, as Gen Z women ourselves, it was really enlightening also, and very inspire also. So I think that was one of the, or like that sort of encapsulates like with the important or like salient findings of our study.
All right, sige. So thank you. We've run out of time. So thank you again and congratulations. We have an abstract. Right? So I think we should just send it to Doc Glenn's. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Glenda, for finding a way. We appreciate you for that. And of course, Miss May, thank you as well for being an instrument for Dr. Glenda. And yeah, Group 1 has gotten or has vacated the stage. I was going to say you have to gotta go your own way. Okay, we now welcome the second group of presenters. The research is entitled Life Beyond the White Coat: Narratives of Women Doctors on Parental Caregiving Practices in the Philippines, by Andy Dueñas, Angela Hilario, and Martha Elizabeth Montemayor, under the supervision of Dr. John Martin Bernard Gapi.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. My name is Angela Hilario, and with me are Martha Montemayor and Andy Dueñas. And today we'll be presenting our thesis presentation, Life Beyond the White Coat, Narratives of Women Doctors on Parental Caregiving Practices in the Philippines. So before beginning, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of our supervisor, Dr. John Gapi, as well as our panelists, Ms. Jessie Claudio and Sir Wilfred Louis Clamore. As well as thank the participants as well as our family for making this research possible. Sorry, I'm not used to this. Oh, sorry, my bad. Okay. So the Philippines is a family-oriented country that places a significant importance on kinship ties. We observe it not only in the law, which recognizes the family as the foundation of the nation, but also in the culture that permeates our everyday life. Filipino values such as close family ties, respect for elders, and utang na loob, or reciprocity, are ones that parents often uphold and pass on to their children. Having a sense of familial obligation is one of the ways these values manifest, and we can observe this to have long-lasting impacts in the way people engage within the family network. In the typical Filipino family, children are often expected to take on a caregiving role for their aging parents. This is especially prevalent not only due to a cultural standpoint, but is also a reflection of the state of Philippine elderly care. While the act of caregiving can be seen as an expression of gratitude towards one's aging parents, it can come with consequences and burdens, whether instrumental, financial, emotional, or even spiritual. Caregiving can be taxing and may require personal sacrifices for the family's welfare. Women, in particular, are found to disproportionately bear the caregiver's burden by feeling socially obligated to prioritize caregiving over personal needs. When compounded with social-cultural expectations to provide familial support, questions are raised about how caregiving as a gendered activity intersects with women's professional lives and what implications this dynamic holds for daughters looking after their aging parents. Our study aims to tackle the following research questions. Number one, how do specific Filipino values such as utang na loob, close family ties, as well as gender expectations contribute to the role that female doctors play in their own families? Number two, how does taking on the caregiving role affect the female doctor's career, personal goals, agency, and social relationships? And lastly, number three, how are local issues, especially those involving access to healthcare and geriatric services, tied with aging and caregiving?
So the study makes use of three theories. One is the family systems theory, which states that within a family, certain roles are implied on each member, and these duties impact how the family functions as a whole. This was applied in analyzing core themes of course, family dynamics, but more specifically, the childhood experiences of female doctors, the extent of care they provide, and the overall effects of caregiving. The second theory is the filial care theory, which refers to the cultural Filipino practice of caring for the elderly as a form of utang na loob. This is relevant since the study looks into how the relationships and childhood experiences influence the distribution of family members' roles. Lastly, the gender schema theory explains that within a certain culture, specific roles are tied to males and females, hence the presence of gender stereotypes. This aids in understanding how caregiving is treated as a woman's work, which is prevalent in this particular study.
Now, the investigation employed a case study approach, retrieving in-depth narratives from 7 participants. Female doctors, who were also the primary caregivers for their families, underwent semi-structured interviews to ensure a standardized yet free-flowing conversation. Upon narrative analysis, the aforementioned concepts were used as a basis for extracting quotes, which gave insights on common behavioral patterns across the sample. Given the professions of the participants, it was imperative that anonymity was ensured. Their real names and workplaces were given aliases, and informed consent forms were also disseminated and signed to confirm their participation. Furthermore, as the investigation covers personal topics, these were made clear to the participants beforehand, and they were also given the option to pause or reschedule the interview given the emergence of discomfort or anxieties. Now, Here we have a summarized table of our participants and the different background information that's provided. Due to time constraints, we won't be able to go into it in full detail, but moving forward to the discussion, we will be detailing the experiences of Dr. Vicente, Dr. Rizal, Dr. Sanchez, Dr. Santos, Dr. De La Cruz, Dr. Gomez, and Dr. Romero. Now, the data sheds light on a series of experiences and sentiments that were evident across the sample. The researchers then managed to narrow down 7 overarching themes, the first being the extent of caregiving practices. Now, this discusses the different variations of care that were provided across their different experiences. Physical care and social care were the 2 common methods of caregiving, with different variations of social care most mentioned. Emotional support is an example which was found to be an integral concept or component in their role as a caregiver. Their responsibilities involved navigating their complex relationships with their parents in dealing with improving their emotional well-being. Now, Uy and Joy et al. Provide insights that supplement these findings. Uy's discussion on the filial care theory puts an emphasis on sentience as a component in caregiving. Joy's discussion, on the other hand, underlines the family systems theories and offers an understanding on emotional relations within the family. Naturally, individual emotions produce an effect on other members of the family, and it was discovered that the emotions of both the caregiver and the recipient have a mutualistic relationship wherein one influences the other. It was also interesting to observe the implementation of both a passive and proactive approach to caregiving, which was most evident in the provision of informational support, medical advice, the management of checkups and medicines, the coordination with specialists are examples of this. The choice of a passive approach was most underlined or most referenced to the practice of transference, which entails the prevention of clouding one's judgment. This was most discussed by one of our doctors as well. This was also supported by Bowen, who underlines the significance of boundaries due to the emotional ties between family members and how they ground their relations. This is also especially important in the context of surrogate decision-making and the reduction of bias in medical advice and management. Instrumental caregiving was the least prevailing caregiving approach, and this could be attributed towards the more moderate illnesses of our care recipients. For the most part, this encompassed adjusted living setups and traveling, wherein the participants had to move to live with or closer to their parents. For some that lived far, they also had to implement traveling time into their schedule so that they could accommodate their caregiving responsibilities.
So analysis of participant narratives reveals that family dynamics significantly shape both the adoption of caregiving roles and the subsequent adaptation to them. Most participants reported healthy family dynamics marked by 3 key characteristics. First, a sense of security. Second, supportive close bonds. And third, positive structural factors, which include autonomy, mutual reciprocity, clear communication, as well as well-defined roles. While dynamics did not uniformly translate to closeness, as relationships were variably described, all participants recognized at least one such trait and affirmed general positive familial ties. Those with strong sibling relationships were notably shown to demonstrate effective caregiving behaviors through shared responsibility. Clear role distinctions not only fostered teamwork, but helped alleviate burdens by enabling a better balance between other obligations. Birth order also emerged as a notable factor in shaping the participants' caregiving approaches. The eldest child, for example, is described as a frequent recipient of responsibility and consequently makes caregiving an inclination. Due to routine expectations, an eldest child is likely to feel obligated to fulfill their assigned roles. This sense of responsibility may either play a positive or negative role, especially when distinctions are left unclear. Out of the 7 participants, only 2 expressed a strained relationship with the subject of caregiving, while 1 explicitly manifested dysfunctional family dynamics. Dysfunctional family dynamics, which is marked by poor boundaries, communication gaps, and role ambiguity, were found to harm both caregivers and care recipients. As Dr. Sanchez's story illustrates, strained relationships can exacerbate caregiving stress and can be triggering. Despite these challenges, however, she remains committed to her mother's care. So, perception of childhood experiences as guided by the family constellation and birth order were also found to impact how caregiving roles are assigned and managed. For eldest children, caregiving responsibilities often become an inherent part of their identity. Having cared for younger siblings throughout their childhood, they seem to naturally extend their role to their aging parents. As the decision-making and rule-setting patterns established in youth persist into adulthood, parental caregiving feels like a continuation of lifelong familial duties. In the case of middle children, relative neglect is often experienced as parental attention is frequently shared or focused on their siblings, thus resulting in weaker parent-child bonds. Dr. Rizal's case presents an exception to this, wherein both she and her siblings received minimal attention, maternal attention, and thereby subsequently diminishing her willingness to provide care to her ailing mother. Similar tensions emerge in Dr. Sanchez's narrative, wherein maternal favoritism towards her older brother complicates the relationship. More significantly, however, she struggles with the perception as being the perpetual child, a phenomenon Vertel identifies as the persistent infantilization of youngest siblings, whose opinions and input are routinely dismissed even into adulthood. This dynamic contrasts with only children's experiences, wherein solo children, like Dr. Romero, are often raised as small adults with considerable autonomy and eventually adopt a more detached caregiving style into their adulthood. On the matter of responsibilities as daughters, the narratives have made it clear that the acquisition of the caregiving role is found to be higher among daughters rather than sons, as women are more involved in caregiving than men. Their experiences and sentiments towards caregiving from a gender perspective seems to be underpinned by a belief that caregiving is a woman's work. Sorry. So, Uy affirms this gender division, wherein wives typically care for older men while daughters help assist the older women. Contrastingly, however, medical professionals like Dr. Romero and Dr. Rizal present an exception. As children from medical families, they view caregiving less through a gendered lens and more of as a familial duty that honors one's parents. Notably, there is a general consensus that caregiving means spending more time with their parents, especially since the constant reminder of mortality in the medical field makes participants appreciate their parents' time alive.
So in terms of the participants' perceptions on caregiving, the interviews showed that the doctors actually have their own reasons for accepting the responsibility. And generally speaking, the value of utang na loob is the reason behind the sense of responsibility that adult children feel toward their parents when their roles are reversed in later years. So for Dr. De La Cruz, her caregiving is not out of obligation, but out of love, as shaped by the way that she was raised. She explains that the pag-aambag was actually never imposed upon them, but it is something that she still wants to do out of her desire to honor her parents. This is in relation to the special relationship model, which highlights the unique emotional bond between parent and child that fosters parental caregiving. However, gender roles also shape these responsibilities, and the gender schema theory suggests that, as mentioned earlier, eldest daughters often bear the burden of caregiving, which is a top contributing factor for taking on the duty. Additionally, being the only doctor in the family further reinforces the role as caregivers, especially because of the notion that they're the most capable ones. So for Dr. Vicente and for Dr. Santos, caregiving is their expression of gratitude. This perspective falls under the past parental sacrifice model, which suggests that parents who sacrificed for their children are taken care of because their offsprings want to return the favor. On the other hand, not all caregiving is entirely voluntary. So for Dr. Sanchez, despite a strained family relationship, she still provides care from a distance, but faces guilt from relatives for not being more involved. It is exacerbated by the fact that she is the only daughter and the only doctor in her family. Moreover, here in the Philippines, placing elderly parents in care homes is seen as shameful. The expectation of family-based care is also reinforced by the acknowledgement of mortality, as our participants have expressed that personally being involved is their way of ensuring that their parents will be around for much longer. So overall, common factors can be summarized into either the participant is an only child, an eldest daughter, or the only doctor in their family. They also put emphasis on how caregiving is either an expression of gratitude, an act of love, or an expressed or imposed responsibility.
The investigation also uncovered a series of implications which provide evidence for the claims of Swinkles. He underscores additional caregiving burdens onto women specifically due to the extent of their commitment and long caregiving hours. One of the greatest challenges faced by the demographic are the physical strains that coincide with their responsibilities, primarily fatigue. For Dr. De La Cruz, the caretaking of her parents entailed taking on an additional job at a location on the other side of Metro Manila to accommodate her family's expenses. Dr. Sanchez frequently has to make trips to her family home within the workday to cater to her mother's needs. Alongside the pressures that already arise from their profession, their caregiving responsibilities add an additional layer of burden to taking a toll on their physical well-being. Emotional strains were also a common experience amongst participants. Often, their frustrations lied in navigating their stubborn behaviors of their parents, and also the negative relationships that they had, alongside dealing with the reality of mortality. Emotional strains also seem to produce the most impact towards our participants, especially for those, again, with complex or negative relationships with their families. Despite this, the benefits that coincided with caregiving or caring for their parents outweighed the emotional toll that it caused. This priority was also evident in the context of career advancements. For many participants, they recounted their experience in choosing their current careers as one that was mainly influenced by their parents. For Dr. De La Cruz, for example, she chose to not take the US medical licensure exam to take care of her parents back here in the Philippines. Meanwhile, Dr. Romero needed to acquire additional educational certification to broaden her skill set in managing and inheriting their family hospital. Additionally, the management of finances were also notable in the participants' caregiving challenges, which added to their stress. Now, despite the impacts caregiving imposes on both the personal and professional life, more notably the missed opportunities for individual successes and improved well-being, caregiving and filial responsibilities took precedence. For a majority of the sample, many recount their experiences with little grievances, describing it as actions that stem not from obligations or force, but from love and giving back, which overpowered the struggles that coincided with their experiences.
So there's also an opportunity to consider the participants' experiences as a result of much larger societal shortcomings. So as mentioned, caregiving in the Philippines is deeply influenced by family dynamics, financial capability, and the accessibility of healthcare services. Families often rely on out-of-pocket expenses as insurance and government support remain limited. In this study, 6 out of 7 doctors are not satisfied with the healthcare situation in our country. Issues such as corruption in PhilHealth, delayed hospital reimbursements, and insufficient healthcare infrastructure are major concerns. Also, it must be pointed out that since elderly care in the country remains family-based, nursing homes are still uncommon due to cultural values. However, this reliance on family caregiving also has its challenges, as not all families have the resources, time, or medical knowledge to provide adequate care. Lastly, the participants talked about how the undercompensation of healthcare professionals in the country is an issue. It leads to the shortage of medical staff, which impacts the quality and availability of care that hospitals are able to provide. The overall consensus is that the healthcare sector needs to undergo institutional development to better cater to older Filipino persons and their families. Ultimately, the data gathered showed the following takeaways. So first, caregiving motivations involve both voluntary acts and obligations influenced by Filipino values like utang na loob and close family ties. Second, daughters still feel a great sense of responsibility when it comes to taking care of their parents, especially given their medical profession. Lastly, the experiences of caregiving are specific to the circumstances of the family or their relationship with their family, which is why setting boundaries between the personal and the professional remains quite subjective. And lastly, for our recommendations, one is to approach it with a multi-layered investigative approach, ideally conducting the study with participants who are physicians that are male at birth, who also provide care to their aging parents. So this will then shift the methodology into a comparative analysis. Also, it is suggested that a quantitative approach be incorporated through the possible dissemination of a survey about caregiving practices to increase the study's sample size. So these recommendations may provide further insights and information about the matter at hand. That is all for our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Group 2. We now welcome your panelists for their comments and suggestions, starting off with Miss Jessica Sandra Claudio.
Ayan. So first of all, congratulations for successfully defending your thesis. Meron lang akong konting questions to clarify findings that you had, no? Yung first one was, siguro start with the questions and then later yung parang feedback na suggestions, no? Hindi, so centered yung study nyo on women doctors, no? So my question is there anything in their interviews that could have potentially hinted at a comparison with male caregivers in the family? Kasi some of them have siblings na lalaki. So meron ba silang naikwento or na-share na parang sila pa rin as women yung expected to do that versus yung male siblings nila? Kasi parang part of the gender schema theory as well na parang balance siya. So that's my first question.
Yes, actually, in the semi-structured interviews, a question there prompted them to share about their siblings. So a few of our participants, not all, but a good number of our participants have siblings or brothers. But the way that they framed their answers was that their brothers are also involved, but not necessarily as involved as them. And the usual setup is that in the case that there was a sibling living with their parents, or if they were living with their parents, it's usually the daughter, and it's the male who lives in a different location, but also contributes, especially financially, but not necessarily as involved as the participants that we interviewed.
Meron bang parang nagsabi na yung sibling nila na lalaki is also a doctor? Kasi parang that may be another layer.
Yes, so one of our final interviews, si Dr. Gomez, I think, actually has, she has 7 siblings, and one of them is a doctor, one of them, her brother is a doctor, but he is residing in the US. But regardless of that fact, she continued to add on about how, despite having brothers, women were still kind of the more nurturing, had the more nurturing roles, which is why it was expected that she would be the one taking care of her mother in that sense.
So parang ano sila, parang perception nila na sila yung expected. Parang it wasn't directly sinabi na parang dahil ikaw ay babaeng anak ko, ikaw ang mag-aalaga sa akin. Palaging perception.
And to parang go back to your last question, there was also an interview wherein she discussed not her personal parang family, but she did witness from her friends' experiences that there was a shared responsibility between both women and men in taking care of their family, but that was not noted within the immediate sample.
Kasi parang shared din. No? Yeah.
I'd like to also add her brother. The case of Dr. Sanchez, who has a strained relationship with her mother, who is the one she's technically giving the caregiving to, is that her mother has favoritism to her brother, and they live together. So she described to us how technically the brother is more hands-on in terms of the daily caregiving. But because she's a doctor and a daughter, she's still being expected to have some form of involvement into the care. Yes.
Yeah. Sige. So, yung pangalawa kong tanong is, your theory, and there are many theories that you had, no, seem to perfectly explain the findings that you're getting. So, parang all the findings that you're getting are aligned with what the theory said. So, parang I was wondering, is there anything that was surprising for you, or that the theory did not, parang na-surprise kayo kasi hindi siya technically assumption nung theory na ginamit ninyo?
I think one of the emerging themes was the acknowledgement of the mortality of their parents. So this is not something that we actually expected the doctors to talk about, but around 2 to 3 participants noted that they personally prefer being that involved in the caregiving towards their parents because it helps them ensure that their parents are being given the proper form or type of care, even in the hospital. So even when they try to embody the act of transference or like giving the task to the specialists of their parents, they still really want to be involved and updated regarding the results or the health conditions of their parents, because it allows them to ensure that their parents are going to be around for a much longer time. And they said that this knowledge is added by the fact that they went to medical school also, so they can kind of gauge the severity the severity of the conditions of their parents. So this is not something that we initially expected to come out of it, but it was also an emerging theme in our research.
Okay. And then the last question before the suggestions is your recommendation center on so of course may academic recommendation kayo for future studies. And then there are family-related recommendations. Pero the last part of your findings is on the healthcare system. So parang I was wondering if in any of your findings, is there a recommendation for the healthcare system, to bridging it with the family as an institution?
So one of the doctors actually brought it up because her family owns a hospital. So she brought up the her plan. It's an ongoing development. Her plan of adding rooms for palliative care in their family hospital, because she believes that palliative care here in the Philippines is actually not that accessible. So she wants to turn at least 3 rooms of their hospital into rooms for patients under palliative care. So I think that's one good recommendation, especially after talking to our participants in their interviews. They brought up the some sort of like stigma towards geriatric care or geriatric services. So it's not something that's very common here in the Philippines. So I think centered on geriatric and palliative care services in the country is the recommendation towards healthcare.
Yeah. So yun lang, parang siguro highlight din. And in terms of suggestion, baka maganda yung nasa slide ninyo na table, syempre matrix, di ba? Table nung to introduce your participants. I like that you did the narratives kasi narrative analysis yung ginawa ninyo. Pero baka the extended one can be placed there. I noticed din kasi that some of the narratives in the introduction don't have the ages of the participants. So baka pwedeng yun. And then the birth order, kasi related siya doon sa discussion ninyo. So parang some of the more pertinent, ang tawag dito, socio-demographic variable, maybe including whether they're married, how many children which you have here, and then their specialization, kasi parang in terms of time and family dynamics. And also in terms of the findings, kasi yung paunang part ng findings ninyo seem to center on category. So parang halimbawa, instrumental care versus information support, if I'm not mistaken. So parang baka pwedeng, kunwari, Doktora Vicente Sanchez, ano yung type of support that they have? Thus, in terms of relationship with the family, is it positive, negative? Some of them are within unhealthy family dynamics. Parang to help lang the reader understand then the context of the participants. So yun lang.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miss Jess. The second panel member to comment is Dr. Wilfred Louis L. Clamor.
Gusto ko binuo talaga ni Sir Art yung akin. Okay, so first and foremost, congratulations, Angge, Martha, and Andy. In your presentation, it's actually a very extensive look into caregiving. You looked into intersections between family dynamics, gender, at the same time work. So very broad and holistic yung pagkakatingin ninyo ng caregiving, which caregiving really is. As I mentioned in your proposal, care or caregiving itself is a holistic practice, particularly amongst Filipinos. Now, I prepared initially 2 questions, but may naisip akong tanong kanina while Jessie is asking you, But the first question, I'm really interested in the duality of personas, of the doctors. And you've mentioned that I forgot the name of the doctor, but there was this experience wherein that doctor cannot take out the persona of being a doctor to her parent, and that's a difficulty at the same time. Well, it's thank you, sir. It's also anong tawag dito, an enriching experience for the doctor. Now, I want to ask if you could further present or describe the experience of the doctor, juggling with this duality of personas. Like, for example, sabi nga, hindi nila maitanggal ang pagkakadoktora nila sa kanilang magulang. Can you provide us a specific scenario or experience na hindi nawala yung pagkadoktora sa kanyang magulang? Yeah, that's my first question.
So, to kind of address this question, one of our doctors, Dr. De La Cruz, was one of the people that discussed the practice of transference, wherein she decides to take a step back when it comes to the caregiving of her family members. This entails it was interesting actually because she discussed how she does not introduce herself to the specialists of her doctors because she really wants to make their their care or their medical advice, very objective and reliable in that sense. And this can kind of also be seen in one of the other, I think Dr. Santos, who discussed how for her kasi it was very emotionally burdensome to experience facing the mortality of her parents, wherein she had to constantly visit the hospital, go to the ICU in order to tend to her dad in that context. And that's when she discussed how because of that, it really clouded her judgment on making medical decisions. I hope that answers your question.
I agree with you on that. That sometimes the persona of the doctor, sometimes it becomes cloudy in a bit because they're dealing with their parents rather than their patients. So may mga ganong klaseng instances talaga, and hindi natin maiiwasan na mawawala na may mga biases din along the way. At the same time, emotions that are affecting one's judgment. But in their case, as you've mentioned, parang pinasaubaya ata nila sa ibang doktor yung yung kanilang mga magulang. Andy, do you want to share something?
So just to add to that, I think another part where they actually have a hard time disregarding the doctor title is when they're having difficulties in getting consultation slots with the doctors of their parents or hospital rooms. So sometimes when they really have no choice, they mention that they would call the hospital and talk to them and introduce themselves as a doctor just so the process can be faster.
Okay. Sige. 2 minutes na lang, I'll just go to my final question. It's good that you also look into the disposition of doctors, particularly their childhood experiences, which influence their caregiving practices. But I'm also interested with the specialization of these doctors. Like, for example, there are some who are yung pediatricians, radiologists, and so on and so forth. Are there nuances with regard to their specialization in relation to their caregiving practices?
Sir, it wasn't clearly defined across all participants, but one of them did point out that one of our two of the doctors that we interviewed were actually from a family of doctors, as mentioned. And one of them, her parents were both radiologists in Baguio, I believe. So she kind of followed that same path
Okay.
as them.
But are there any specific strategy? For example, kapag ano ba tawag dito? Palliative care ang specialization ng doctor. More on palliative caregiving ang practice niya. Anesthesiologist, ito ang kanyang practice. Or radiologist, more on the internal organs of the patient of their parents.
Sir,
Di
I
ganun
think
ba?
one of the participants mentioned that she finds it helpful, or she's grateful that her specialization doesn't completely align with the conditions of her parents, because that allows her to really disregard the doctor title and leave her with no choice but to get specialist doctors for her parents. So since among all our participants, none of them focus on geriatrics or palliative care, or none of their specializations actually really align with the health conditions of their parents, they're able to embody the act of transference more because of this.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. May other
Thank you,
comments will be
sir.
sent to Sir John. All right.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Clamor. Sir Gapi, would you like to speak up?
Not too long anymore. Just to say congratulations. And I feel the same with other advisors. I guess we've been working with our teams day and night sometimes. So congratulations, and congratulations also for those who will be presenting towards the end.
Thank you po.
Thank you, Dr. Gapi. Thank you, Andy, Angela, and Martha Elizabeth. You may now sashay away in your black coat. Not white, but black. Except for Angel, who's wearing a white top. Angela. So we're halfway through the afternoon session. We now welcome our third group of presenters. Consisting of Joaquin Miguel Dagdag Farinas and Jose Alonzo Ligon Pilares. Their research is titled Full Court Press, Crashing the Boards of Philippine Women's Basketball. Their supervisor is Miss Jessica Sandra R. Claudio.
It's not working. Oh. Okay. So before we start lang, thank you po Sir Nino and si Ma'am Melissa. I don't know if you're watching, but thank you po for yung comments niyo po that you gave us. We understand na we only met once, pero sana naman we were able to do right by you guys and your comments through this, was essentially a culmination of a year's worth of work. And Ma'am Jessie, maraming salamat po. Alam ko na Jiggy and I aren't always the most diligent of students. Yeah, so thank you for pushing us whenever we get discouraged, and yeah, shout out to you guys. Thank you. So okay, so good day everyone. As mentioned, I'm Jose Alonzo Ligon Pilares, and my partner Joaquin Miguel Dagdag Farinas is here with me today. So we're going to be presenting to you our thesis entitled Full Court Press, Crashing the Boards of Philippine Women's Basketball. So our research delves into the structural and cultural barriers that female athletes face in collegiate basketball here in the Philippines. We are excited to share the insights we've gathered and the impact we hope it will have on this evolving field of study. So to start, our research aims to examine the systemic challenges female athletes face in collegiate women's basketball in the Philippines. So despite basketball's widespread popularity in the country, women's basketball remains overshadowed by its male counterpart. Our study aims to highlight the experiences of the players and the coaches, as well as the barriers within women's basketball. Focusing on these allowed us to make insights that can drive policy reform in relation to institutional support, media representation, and promoting gender equity in Philippine sports. So our research aims to answer three core questions. First of them being, how do the experiences of female basketball players and coaches reflect broader societal attitudes towards gender and sports in the Philippines? And how do these contribute to the successes and challenges faced by female athletes? How do female basketball players and coaches perceive the role of media coverage in shaping public perceptions of women's basketball in the Philippines? And lastly, what opportunities and challenges arise in pushing for a professional women's basketball league, and what support is necessary for its success?
Okay, so we're just going to have a short overview of our review-related literature. So, hegemonic masculinity, rooted in Gramsci's cultural hegemony, maintains dominance in sports through norms that prioritize winning, physical dominance, and emotional detachment, marginalizing women, LGBTQIA+ athletes, and non-conforming men. Historically, Victorian-era beliefs framed women as fragile, restricting them to leisure sports, and even in competitive play, rules are reinforced to be ladylike. Today, the ideal female body has shifted from thin and slim to tight and toned, yet remains commodified through fitness industries. Female athletes in male-dominated sports face disparities in resources, media coverage, and career opportunities. A 2014 study by Sherry et al. Highlights their pressure to excel academically due to limited professional prospects. Coaches in women's basketball also navigate gendered expectations and resource gaps, but often foster community empowerment. In the Philippines, basketball was introduced to girls in 1910, but quickly restricted, labeled as a men's-only sport by 1915. It may have reemerged in 1939 via the Philippine Ladies Athletic Association. However, this reflects the women's historical exclusion in the sport. Despite challenges, women's basketball is gaining traction. Scholarships attract international talent, increasing visibility and signaling a shift toward greater inclusivity in sports. Women in sports face limited opportunities, resources, and media coverage, which reinforce traditional gender roles. While events like the Olympics boost visibility, consistent, fair representation is key to driving social change and creating economic opportunities. The gender pay gap persists despite comparable performances. The WNBA and NBA wage gap disparity, for instance, stems from unequal revenue sharing and limited exposure. Even in sports like tennis and soccer, where some female athletes surpass men in audience reach, pay inequities remain due to market factors like sponsorships and ticket sales. Women also struggle to break into leadership roles in sports organizations, facing structural barriers and biases that label assertiveness as quote-unquote masculine. A shift toward transformational leadership is needed to challenge these limitations and foster gender equity in sports management.
So for our methodology, which aimed to gather experiences, qualitative research was needed using snowball sampling and in-depth interviews with players and coaches from Ateneo de Manila University and the University of the Philippines. So with the results, a thematic analysis was done to identify patterns and recurring themes. It is also important to note that within the interview and contacting process, ethical considerations were also crucial, ensuring confidentiality and informed consent throughout the study. We'd also like to mention how we elected to invite key witnesses who were women to show our positionality as male basketball enthusiasts.
Okay, so for the conceptual framework, we decided to use a socio-ecological model, or SEM, developed by Yuri Bronfenbrenner in 1977. It explains how individuals interact with their environment across multiple levels. This framework is useful in analyzing experiences of college female basketball players, particularly how hegemonic masculinity manifests at all levels, may it be individual, interpersonal, institutional, or community-wide. So here's just like a short rundown of our participants. We were able to gather 14 total participants, 10 players, and 4 coaches. The players range from first to fifth year, one even being an MA student, and the coaches also vary from being a head coach or an assistant coach with varying levels of experience. Now towards our findings and analysis. First is that women's basketball in the Philippines remains male-dominated, with female players often introduced to the sport through male family members. Few female role models contribute to the perception that men's basketball is more significant. Players also experience limited opportunities and gender discrimination, such as delayed access to varsity teams and being overlooked by male teammates. And one example here is Magis, as you can see her quote over there, where she talks about how her brother has really impacted her journey in basketball. However, as her brother was able to be a varsity player as early as in the first grade, she had to wait until the sixth grade as there was no varsity team at that time. Significant resource disparities exist between men's and women's basketball teams, particularly in funding, sponsorships, and institutional support. Ateneo players reported more frustration over unequal treatment, while UP athletes acknowledged improvements but noted inefficiencies in resource allocation. So in Ateneo, one of the respondents talked about how the Ateneo women's basketball team has to go through a process similar to all sports teams in Ateneo, whereas their male counterparts, as they are being handled by a third-party organization, did not have to go all through this, facing conflicts in their regard, having a harder time to gain sponsorships. For UP, Coach Famana did note that if you were to compare it back to 2003, when he was watching UP, he was seeing the resources and support from the university really not be there, from limited dorms, no food, so on and so forth. And now, UP, quote-unquote, gives you everything. And media coverage remains biased, favoring more traditional feminine athletes. Past leagues have even Past weeks have even enforced appearance-based regulations, reinforcing gender norms. Additionally, women's teams receive fewer international opportunities, limiting their career prospects compared to men's teams. So when it comes to the feminine features, a lot of players also noted this down, and particularly with the two UP coaches, they cited instances of rules in the past in some semi-professional and some high school leagues where tattoos weren't allowed, shaved heads weren't allowed, and in order to attract more audience, they would actually require their players to wear makeup. So despite recent progress such as increased UAAP visibility and the Women's Maharlika Pilipinas Basketball League, or the WMPBL, women's basketball still faces structural and cultural barriers. Equal funding, better media representation, and stronger institutional support are necessary for long-term growth and gender equity in Philippine sports.
So our next set of findings, also reveal structural and financial barriers in the sport. So many players and coaches acknowledge that the Women's Maharlika Pilipinas Basketball League, or the WMPBL, while although promising, is still in its early stages, leaving players uncertain about their professional future. I think we can see here with the quote from Kaya, player from UP, how she's not necessarily sold on the prospect of the WMPBL yet. And as a result, participants still view the UAAP as the highest level of competition for women's basketball in the country. Moving on to the second one, hand in hand with their professional aspirations, some players see playing abroad to be a better path. While many still see the UAAP as the peak of their basketball careers due to the lack of stable professional pathways here in the Philippines. One exemplary example of this was probably Ina from Ateneo. She mentioned how after college she would try to pursue a doctorate, and it was already discussed with her and her parents even before she became a women's basketball player for Ateneo that she would only do it during her college career and not exceed that. So aside from these barriers, the players also learned valuable lessons from being in the sport, such as discipline. I think we can see here lessons from the game that the coaches both from Ateneo and UP stressed the importance of using basketball as a way to get an education for their players. They see it as not only an education but being part of the team and being, in a culture that is similar to Ateneo and UP. You get to become better students, better athletes, and also learn how to, coalesce in as a team. So Ateneo players, for example, reflected how basketball shaped their values, focusing on their growth, while UP players highlighted the practical skills that basketball can teach them. So applying this to our conceptual framework, we see how the interactions on a personal level all the way to the community level interact and influence each other, which we will further discuss in the succeeding slides. So at the individual level, players are motivated by their personal growth and discipline gained through the sport. So their experiences and motivations for the sport stem through their close male family members, as we can see here. And players like Lovely from UP emphasized how basketball instilled important values, and it helps them manage their responsibilities as student athletes. Similar to what I mentioned in the findings, that coaches from both schools stressed the importance of using basketball as a means to secure quality education. They mentioned this because, as it says here, players recognize that this is a short-term endeavor, so the coaches are emphasizing a life or a career after basketball if it does not suit them as well as others. On the interpersonal level, Magis, a player from Ateneo, highlights how following her brother's basketball journey deepened her connection to the sport. And this was a very recurring theme in our data gathering, as all participants in the study acknowledged the unwavering support that they received from their families. Team relationships naman, players emphasize the importance of the circle, which provides the team and its members emotional security and motivation. So this is also another recurring theme, as both teams mentioned the circle that they have where nothing would ever enter it and nothing would ever leave it. So it also shows how close they are as a team and shows the strong bonds formed within them. And it also serves as a buffer against negative media or any societal perceptions that go against them.
Okay, so now for the institutional side. Despite the high-level platform provided by the UAAP and other collegiate leagues, significant disparities in funding, facilities, and promotional efforts remain. Drawing from Wire, as cited in Stelter 2002, these disparities stem from institutional biases and entrenched gender norms that lead to unequal resource allocation. While the data focuses on the experiences of Ateneo and UP players, one can infer that these challenges are likely magnified in smaller basketball programs in and outside of the UAAP. And while recent efforts by the UAAP, such as media days and streaming via the Pilipinas Live app, have helped increase visibility, these improvements remain inconsistent. Kislap from Ateneo pointed out that the inclusion of courtside reporters and mid-game gimmicks, which are common in men's tournaments, could lend more legitimacy and excitement to women's games. These additions could potentially increase audience engagement and elevate the public perception of women's basketball. The underrepresentation of women's sports creates a cycle, where reduced media attention leads to diminished public interest, which then results in fewer sponsorships and minimal institutional backing. Without an established professional league, female athletes in the Philippines have limited post-college careers prospects in basketball. Schiedler and Wagstaff emphasize that media coverage plays a pivotal role in shaping public attitudes towards the female athletes. Prolonged and consistent media coverage not only humanizes female athletes, but also enhances their marketability. And now for the community side, basketball in the Philippines is deeply ingrained as a male-dominated sport, as we have mentioned, shaping how opportunities and engagement for women's basketball develop. Many female athletes cite male players as their early inspiration due to the lack of visible female role models. Women's participation is often undervalued due to this, leading to fewer opportunities and less community support. Cultural norms reinforce the perception that women are physically less capable, limiting their inclusion in high-stakes competitions. Sports spaces are largely seen as sites for celebrating masculinity, relegating women to secondary roles where their achievements are downplayed. Limited public enthusiasm for women's basketball and lower attendance, fewer sponsorships, and fewer role models for aspiring female athletes. The belief that sport success equates to masculinity discourages young girls from seeing basketball as a career option. Whiteside and Hardin argue that women's sports are often consumed in ways that reinforce gender roles, such as through relationship maintenance with men, rather than genuine fandom. This perspective marginalizes women's sports in media, further reducing engagement and reinforcing the notion that it is less valuable than men's basketball. The lack of visibility and community support creates barriers to building a strong and sustainable fan base. While the UAAP has contributed to increased media visibility, traditional gender norms still influence how female athletes are portrayed. Some players and coaches report that femininity is often emphasized to attract media attention, as mentioned earlier, reflecting the influence of the male gaze on women's sports coverage. This reinforces gender stereotypes even unintentionally and affects how women's basketball is perceived. And lastly, Creedon highlights while greater media coverage can empower female athletes, it can also exploit them through portrayals that cater to male viewership rather than focusing on their athletic achievements. To support women's basketball effectively, media coverage should be consistent, respectful, and free from gendered biases, ensuring that visibility leads to meaningful progress rather than reinforcing existing inequalities. So to conclude, using the socio-ecological model, it highlights how interpersonal relationships, organizational structures, and community perceptions influence female athletes' development and career paths. Despite basketball's cultural significance in the Philippines, it remains male-dominated, limiting the opportunities for women. Interviews revealed that while college basketball fosters discipline and resilience, systemic barriers such as resource disparities, lack of media visibility, and the absence of a stable professional league prevent female athletes from fully realizing their potential. These challenges reinforce a glass ceiling, making basketball an unviable long-term career option for women. At the individual and the interpersonal levels, most female players were introduced to basketball through male family members, reinforcing gendered perceptions of the sport. And at the community level, hegemonic masculinity continues to shape sports culture, affecting visibility and legitimacy for women's basketball. While initiatives like the WMPBL show promise, concerns about its sustainability highlight the need for the structural reforms and investment. This study emphasizes addressing systemic inequities through policy reforms, improved media representation, and stronger institutional support is crucial for creating a more inclusive and supportive sports environment for female athletes in the Philippines. For recommendations, first and foremost, media should go beyond game highlights and feature in-depth narratives and player stories to showcase the talents and personal journeys of female athletes. Both large media outlets and student-led university platforms can contribute to increased visibility. Continuing to normalize equal media coverage for men's and women's basketball, similar to UAAP's ongoing efforts, will help them challenge the male gaze, ensuring that female athletes are portrayed authentically based on their skill and achievements rather than their stereotypes. Expanding sports programs for young girls is crucial to developing women's basketball across the country. This includes community-based clinics, school partnerships, and mentorship programs connecting young athletes with experienced players. Scouting efforts should reach diverse provinces, leveraging local schools and community centers to identify and nurture talent, ensuring a steady pipeline of future players and increasing nationwide competitive. To address disparities between men's and women's basketball, institutions must commit to fairer funding, access to training facilities, medical support, and coaching expertise. Policy should ensure a fixed percentage of sports funding is allocated to women's programs. Further, college and sports leagues and corporate sponsors must collaborate to establish professional leagues, develop training initiatives, and enhance marketing efforts for women's basketball. Strengthening financial and institutional support will not only improve the sport, but also provide a stable career path for female athletes in the Philippines.
So for our last set of recommendations, to promote a gender-sensitive sporting culture that challenges stereotypes and ensures inclusivity, there should be gender-sensitive policies implemented and supported by educational campaigns to challenge stereotypes in sports. Next, for the support of career development of female athletes, offering scholarships and industry partnerships for post-college pathways is a good way for players to navigate and explore the options or opportunities at hand. With this, partnerships with investors and industry leaders would be encouraged for proper funding. And lastly, while we understand that we are treading very uncharted waters, further studies should be done to explore the professional league and its development to better understand the challenges and opportunities it presents from a different lens or from different regions of the Philippines. Having more insights would be helpful in developing the scene of women's basketball, wherein it helps all aspiring female players. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joaquin Miguel and Jose Alonso. Now, we're inviting Dr. Enrique Nino Pileviste to give his comments and suggestions for Group 3.
Thank you, Art. Just 2 questions and the rest, I'll just send to you via email. All right. My first question has something to do with what we already discussed last November, and I think it's still relevant today. I commend you first and foremost for the relative thickness of the data that you got from basketball players and coaches in Ateneo and UP. I think that's a good problem to have. But I was wondering, in relation to that, what the theoretical significance of the data as a whole is, pertaining particularly to your concept, your conceptual anchor, which is hegemonic masculinity. In other words, my first question is, based on the data that you got from your key informants, are there multiple ways of understanding hegemonic masculinity? Because understandably, there is a multitude of literature that discusses hegemonic masculinity. Raywin Connell would be one of them, would be one of the most notable theorists of hegemonic masculinity. So based on your journey, on your intellectual journey, do you get a sense of how diverse understandings or theorizations of hegemonic masculinity is? So that's my first question.
So yes, thank you for that wonderful question. I definitely agree that there's a lot to dive into when it comes to hegemonic masculinity. I think one thing that we weren't able to particularly highlight but is important to note is that there's a lot of intersectionalities when it comes to our research participants. So there are some of them that did not have as much resources, hence why they appreciate the resources that they are given now in the university level. This being said, while there are people who thrive in a sports environment, and well, quite frankly, they do all thrive in a sports environment, hence why they're in a varsity team, there are different ways to understand this in the sense that they still understand that their competitiveness is limited at a certain level, and that level is at a glass ceiling, which is the university level basketball for right now in the Philippines.
Pahabol lang po. I remember in our brief conversation then with the coaches from the Ateneo, na they mentioned they try to emphasize to their players to just keep it to basketball. So, in relating to what I said a while ago about having a very, very deep and connected circle, parang you just get to focus on what they do, and that's basically basketball as a whole. Like, you don't really try to relate it to anything outside of that because yun lang yung trabaho nila. Basically, parang trabaho lang po.
Okay. Maraming salamat. Baka yun yung ambag ninyo, no? Yung binanggit mo kanina, Jiggy, about intersectionality, because, and I may be mistaken, no? Rarely do we explain hegemonic masculinity in terms of intersectionality, and I think that's the main contribution, one of the main contributions of your work. Perhaps moving forward as you revise, no, may panahon pa naman, no, may oras pa naman. Baka pwede nyo pang mas palakasin o patingkarin yung aspetong yon, no? Explaining hegemonic masculinity, no, through the lens of intersectionality. No? So that's probably something you can further explore, no, with your supervisor. My last question for you this afternoon would be on your methodological rationale. No? We talked about this too. Nung una, during your thesis proposal defense in November, ang pinag-usapan natin Ateneo and UST. Ngayon, Ateneo and UP na. No? I do respect, and I personally find it important to highlight personal connections. No? They may be subjective, but nonetheless they're important, no, in gathering robust empirical data. But in explaining it academically, we have to go beyond it. No? Hinighlight nyo yon, and that's important. No, I appreciate that. But perhaps, just to explain further, ano ba yung nakikita nyong rationale talaga kung bakit Ateneo and UP yung napili natin na pagtuunan ng pansin when in fact maraming ibang UAAP basketball teams, no, na nagta-thrive relatively?
So basically, it all boils down then to availability, sir. So noong una, UST wasn't nagkaka-conflict in schedule, so we weren't really able to touch base with them na about that. And I think Jiggy just says na they just flat out didn't respond to us anymore. Ateneo naman po, I think it's also because we're students then they were able to accommodate us. But in terms of why we chose these schools, Ateneo has a very respected basketball culture. It's characterized with winning. So I think na it was also essential for us, as we are very, very big basketball fans of the Ateneo program, na to also include them na rin in our study, because in a way it's our way of giving back to them din siguro. For the UP naman, we were just talking about this a while ago, and it was actually quite funny because I remember UP had a season, I think it was in 2015 yata, where they held a bonfire just for winning one game. So to go from that parang culture to being a title contender for these past few years really just goes to show how evolved their program has been. So if you try to apply that for their women's program, what is their culture now? Like, are they a winning culture, or does it support winning in the sense that uh, in the sense that if you've come from that low on the hierarchy to go to being one of the schools that students and prospects aspire to go to for college, parang it just goes to show the contrast between being down there and then being the pinnacle of what basketball culture should be for college students.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
I just would like to add from like what Zor also talked about. So Ateneo and UP women's basketball are also two very competitive teams in the women's basketball sphere, though not as competitive as their male counterparts. They show significant progress and significant level of play whenever they're in the court. So in the previous UAAP season, Ateneo finished fourth, while UP barely missed the Final Four by finishing fifth. However, the season before, UP did finish third, a podium finish, and Ateneo also finished fourth once again that season, highlighting that these teams are semi-final contenders. And another thing to bout is in the recently concluded Titan women's tournament thing that they had due to Sabrina Ionescu's tour over here, those two teams actually played in the finals at the same stage where Sabrina Ionescu played amidst a large crowd in Araneta Coliseum. So that goes to show that you're getting from a historical winning team such as Ateneo basketball and a growing UAAP program, a fast-growing UAAP program at that with UP basketball, and showing these together on how it compares to one that's been doing this for years, one that's kind of new to the competitive system. It's very important to see and very intriguing to see the differences and their perspectives on their own lived experiences.
Okay, articulate that. No, that's very important. Yung mga sinabi nyo ngayon, isulat niyo. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Dr. Leviste. The second panelist for Group 3 is Dr. Maria Elisa J. Lau. She's not physically around, but she sent her comments and suggestions through Miss Jess.
So si Ma'am Melissa, maybe she's watching, only has 2 questions. The first one is, can you cite similarities and differences between players and coaches' assertions and the literature? So meron bang nagbago from what you cited in your RRL versus what they said, the players and the coaches said? Yun yung una.
Yes, okay. So first and foremost, like, we have to understand that there is a little literature to talk about when it comes to the kind of topic that we are diving into. Second, when it comes to if we're looking at it in a general sense, there were a lot of similarities in a sense that hegemonic masculinity and gender biases are still seen towards women's basketball in the Philippines, and it still persists today. However, one thing I would like to say that is quite different is to the little local studies that were given to us to read about, like Anthony House work and stuff like that. A lot of it was, it was made 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, there's already a big change in UAAP basketball and women's basketball as a whole, not just in the Philippines, but the whole world. So 10 years ago in the UAAP, only the finals and Ateneo and LaSalle matches were showcased. Now, all UAAP games can be streamed on the Pilipinas Live app and replays for 149 pesos. Okay, but for real here, as the old saying goes, malayo na pero malayo pa ang is one thing that we can say about women's basketball. And seeing how far women's basketball has come, even from that vantage point 10 years ago, is really nice to see.
Yeah, and siguro the second question is also a perfect segue kasi you mentioned the media aspect. The second question ni Ma'am Melissa is, what more can you say about media apart from there's now, like, you can now parang watch all the games, no? Kasi sabi niya, it's quite short in your discussion in the manuscript, but it is a major research question. So parang yung balance between discussing it and thickening the data, kasi major research question nyo siya. So yun, what more can you say about the media?
So I first want to start by answering this by discussing basketball in the Philippines as a whole. So I'm not sure if you guys are familiar, pero after the NBA in the United States, which is probably the most popular basketball league in the world, the Philippines was actually the first country in Asia to have its own professional basketball league. So I'm not necessarily sure what exact year it was, but if you just go from that uh, fact alone, parang the culture of basketball throughout the years has more or less stayed the same. We can see na rin with the PBA, how it's structured. It basically hasn't changed because, as we can see, there have been issues with revenue kasi nobody really watches their games. But with a supposed historic culture of basketball in the country, parang it's really surprising to see na women's basketball has a very, very small percentage of that lang. So, siguro with their study, parang it's emphasizing more on what the future of women's basketball in the can be for aspiring young girls and okay, Jiggy, go on.
Okay, so yeah, just to add on to what Zor was talking about, media definitely plays a big factor into how shapes sports are seen here in the Philippines, definitely, and this can be seen in a lot of sports. A lot of sports here. First, if we double back in time, like why volleyball became very popular in the Philippines was because of Elisa Valdez. Ooh, one big fight. But Elisa Valdez did become first famous because of how good she was. But I think the cherry on top was first and foremost the finals match against Ateneo and LaSalle season 76, game 4, was telecasted in ABS-CBN, not the sports channel, ABS-CBN channel, which showcased it to a broader wide range of audience. And on top of that, after that season, she got her own little documentary showcase in ABS-CBN Sports in Action. And even later on, with, let's say, Alex Ayala, a lot of people did point out on how good she is as a tennis player. However, people also really gravitated towards her as she's relatable, as she carries Filipino humor, as seen in like her recent reel where she used to sound like "Ako ay sumakses," like that one. A lot of people definitely like grew to being fans about her. And my point here is there's way more things to talk about that the media hasn't really dabbled into. It's more than just showcasing how they're good, showcasing their highlights, but rather also showing how they are as people. And perhaps this could also inspire a lot of young girls to carry a basketball and to carry the values that these athletes behold.
Yeah, siguro maybe the recommendation of Doc Melissa is to articulate that in your, and also base it off your findings from the interviews. Kasi I feel like you have your own knowledge, but we have to also listen to the voice of the athletes.
Yes, ma'am.
So, yun.
Thank you very much, Miss Jess, for communicating Dr. Lau's comments and suggestions. Thank you, Joaquin Miguel and Jose Alonso. You will now pass on the ball from basketball to another game, but it's in a digital platform.
Thank you,
So
po.
we now welcome the last
Thank you,
group
po.
of presenters. Audrey Nadine T., Ethan Matthew Nara, and Francis Sioson Australia. Their study is titled "To Queer or Not to Queer? Navigating Industry and Identity Among LGBTQ+ Filipino Video Game Developers." Their supervisors are Mr. Mark Remington Estan and yours truly.
Good day, panelists, professors, and blockmates. We'd truly like to thank you all, especially Sir Peter Lorenzana, Doc Anjo Lorenzana, and Miss Jessie Claudio, and our two thesis advisors, Sir Art and Sir Rem, for all your time being here today, online, on-site, or asynchronously, and thank you in advance for listening. We're here to present our thesis titled "To Queer or Not to Queer? Navigating Industry and Identity Among LGBTQ Filipino plus Video Game Developers." Let's begin. Gaming's growth can't be ignored nowadays, especially in popular culture and its own economic power. And as much as many millions of Filipinos play games, the same can't be said for the popularity of its development. Globally and locally, the video game industry is known to be precarious in its employment, and the same can sadly be said for gender inequality towards women and the LGBTQ+. but we don't usually hear about these issues locally. Not only because of its admittedly lacking coverage, but also because of the hegemonies and dominance that can silence these voices. Discrimination, death threats, and even more instability to already precarious careers. Within this context, queerness and being queer can magnify the voices and experiences towards these social cultural issues, not just as persons especially mistreated and marginalized, but also as video game developers themselves who want to tell their own stories in spite of their precarious marginalization. And of course, perhaps not all LGBTQ+ video game developers desire to tell such a story. And so while we can't determine their journeys, let's at least listen to find out more. Through this study, we hope to make these marginalized voices behind the games we play heard and made accessible by exploring not only how LGBTQ+ Filipino video game developers navigate their identities within this industry, but also how the concept of queerness is constructed based on conditions of production and then can be negotiated and contested by representation, by queering, to be explained, and by the LGBTQ+ and not alike. Thus, our main research question. How do LGBTQ+ video game developers navigate their identities in video game production from a queer perspective? To clarify this further, we have 3 additional sub-questions focusing on social-cultural conditions of production, the negotiation and contestation of queerness, and whether LGBTQ+ video game developers queer in video game production. Our conceptual framework will employ 4 main concepts, namely identity, production, hegemony, and queerness. Identity markers like gender, sexual orientation, and as a video game developer can be set in the past or present, but as the social structures giving meaning to these identity markers change, so do the markers themselves. Who we are, what we do, and what we become change over time, but it doesn't mean one can't orient to stabilize the self, even in a fluid context. This fluid context also leads to the concept of production. Creativity in game making is situated within the video game culture industry, estranging creative expression from producing games. Love for games become a labor of love, not only because of this estrangement, but also because of the precarity game devs accept working in the industry. Low salary, high mobility in working conditions and practices. Hegemony integrates into this production culture. How queerness is represented in games and treated in real-life conditions can be affected by hegemonic heteronormativity and masculinity, resulting in intensified estrangement, both as a developer and as particular genders and sexual identities. Lastly, but not the least, queerness has 2 interrelated definitions we'll reference. First, as a marker of identity for non-conforming identities, and second, as a way of being, doing, and desiring differently against what hegemonies dictate to be accepted, valued, and normal within the industry. Queerness provides the lens to explore one's identity by 1. Resisting dominant beliefs of pleasures and power, 2. Naming a longing to live life otherwise, and 3. Making a space within structures of power for resistance. All is as visualized in the following framework.
So now to elaborate further on the conceptual framework, we will also be discussing the 4 subsections of our review of related literature. So to start, for production studies, culture industry becomes a site for locating human agency vis-a-vis the social structures. With this in mind, it also becomes evident or observable how the video game industry, as a culture industry, also becomes a site for video game developers to navigate themselves within the site of labor. And for the video game industry, finding authenticity and creativity becomes a challenge due to the structures of production, with this being culture becoming an industry where the video game industry is subject to commodifying culture, and as such, profitable standards are prioritized. And creativity becomes labor, where video game developers are being subjected to overwork, power relations, and even restrictions to creative expressions. And this is why for Kiyog as well, due to these climates within the industry, some game developers are compelled to quote-unquote make do instead of make it. By making do, he meant that instead of following a conventional path to success, Some game developers are able to negotiate alternative ways of game making that are driven by passion and desire for creative expression. And moving on, we also need to situate queerness. The word queer could be understood both as an identity and as an ideology or framework, as said earlier by Audrey. Queer, or the act of queering, becomes relevant in understanding of what it is like to quote-unquote live life otherwise, especially in the context of the video game industry, where heteronormativity and hegemonic masculinity remains to be pervasive. And as mentioned earlier, heteronormativity and hegemonic masculinity becomes observable due to how games are catered to the male gaze. Games are reliant on normative tropes that are stuck to the binary standards of gender and even to the standards of the West. And this also becomes observable to how there is a lack of inclusive queer representation present in games, despite the player base slowly becoming more diverse. And lastly, why study video games? Though originally disregarded due to how video games are seen as a children's medium or a mere entertainment, studying video games becomes a relevant direction for academic studies because nowadays, video games have also become integrated into everyday culture such as in media and popular culture. And within spaces of contested heteronormativity and masculinity, video games have also largely applied as a quote-unquote canary in a coal mine for hegemonic toxicity which targets marginalized identities and categories, like women and the LGBTQ plus community. Thus, again, it can also be a site for negotiations and contestations.
So let's go through a quick rundown of the methodology. So we primarily employed a qualitative research approach, as was suggested to us during our proposal stage. So this simple approach allowed a great deal of flexibility while still being able to cover or describe the breadth and depth of the situation that our game devs are facing. To collect the data, semi-structured interviews were conducted. Questions were prepared beforehand, but of course, space was given for follow-up questions whenever something interesting came up. So all of these interviews were conducted online, and audiovisual recordings and transcripts are present, provided that all ethical considerations were followed. So to analyze the data, we use thematic analysis as famously enumerated by Brown and Clark. We essentially simply follow the steps they enumerate there, so familiarizing ourselves with the data, generating the initial code, searching for themes, etc., etc. So our research participants are current or former game devs with working experience. So if you made a career out of making games in any capacity, whether indie, independent, or in a corporate setting, you qualified for the study. Of course, you also had to be a member of the LGBTQ plus community. So the researchers had limited insider knowledge about the local game dev industry. We were more familiar with what is publicly available and the foreign industry, meaning primarily Western or Eastern games or game developers. So the research site is primarily the places of employment the game devs were in or are in, as the situations we describe in our paper is mostly take place in those kinds of contexts. But there is also the internet, as it is a pervasive aspect of the industry as well. So speaking of our participants, these are our participants. We were only able to interview 5. So we initially used purposive sampling by contacting a few individuals, but then switched to snowball sampling through referrals. So now for our results and discussions, where we analyze our findings and themes. Oh my God. Yeah, I know. Wait. Sorry. So profitability is the main goal, or rather it is the lifeline of video game companies and developers. So much so that the success or failure of a game can dictate if they can continue making games or even remain in the industry as a whole. So when game companies place their developers into precarious positions to prioritize profit. Video game developers need to balance between the desire to create games and their need to survive. So it may not that this kind of decision may not even be up to them, as the heads of the companies, shareholders, etc., determine whether they get laid off, have a lower incomes, or are subject to bad working conditions. But these conditions of production are not the only source of precarity. Gender and sexual identities are also subject to another layer of precarity. So, in particular, women and LGBTQ plus individuals are subject to all sorts of forms of discrimination, such as not being able to be promoted as fast as men. As they are faced with assumptions based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, and with that, it really shows how discrimination in the industry is both systemic and can be individualized, because if these queer identities or gender identities are exposed or are disclosed, they may be faced with social exclusion or even harassment. So this discrimination is further magnified by the normalized dominance of men, masculinity, and of course heterosexuality. In particular, women and LGBTQ plus individuals are compelled or are set to the standards of men. So whenever inserting any form of queerness or femininity even, it is faced with multiple challenges because it, quote unquote, makes things complicated, according to all our respondents actually. So the male gaze is of course this powerful force that sort of rejects queer games with queer themes, content, and they are bound to be faced with certain amounts of criticism and bashing.
Okay, to elaborate this further, we will delve into how queerness could be situated within the site of labor. So, the working environment and decision-making process through the video game production influence how queerness is expressed both covertly and overtly. Some companies have a more open and conducive approach in terms of decision-making process, thus could be a potential for queer representation to be discussed and negotiated. And this happens more for indie companies compared to corporate companies. And on the other hand, some companies are more stringent and not as accommodating as others. This happens more likely with corporate companies where specific instructions and strict guidelines for creative direction are given to artists. And as such, quote unquote, just do what the client says, as Kira Kira Kat would express it. And this is why Rai would describe it as working on an assembly line, because no room for negotiations could be made. And decision makers in game companies, whether indie or corporate, are always informed by what is marketable and profitable, and as such, leaving queer representation to not be considered due to how most companies value what is normative. And it is usually not the artist's prerogative to create quote-unquote a queer character. Artists are only instructed and told what they are told to do or to express via their creative expression. And artists may be able to suggest, but the decision to ideate and the approval for the final design and overall theme of the game are mainly decided by the higher-ups. And with this being in mind, video game developers and companies cannot please everyone in the video game market, especially when it comes to queer representation. There is a need for video game companies to recognize that there is a need to take a stance, especially if they want to produce inclusive queer representation. And again, it also boils down to the intent of the producers. Do they want to focus on profitability and as such, surface level of queer representation, or to also take it one step further by empowering LGBTQ plus players by emphasizing their experiences along the way? But since usually profitability is prioritized rather than representation, there's a more efficient compromise to have queer coding rather than no representation at all. And lastly, in deciding if the game is a quote-unquote a story worth telling, game companies are compelled to balance their decisions based on profit, representation, and potential backlash and criticisms. This is why for inclusive queer representation to be produced, as said earlier, Adi and Kira Kirakat argued that there is a need for companies to take their stance and be committed to it. Moving on, this is why, as a form of a negotiated response to covertly express queerness, especially where queerness can't be expressed due to the said climate, queer coding then becomes an avenue for video game developers because its subtle representation could pass through higher ups, like stakeholders, shareholders, and directors. And this could also be accepted by female and queer audiences, albeit subtle hints of queerness. And more importantly, queer coding also becomes an avenue for LGBTQ plus game developers to normalize queerness via representation, even through subtle hints that are unnoticeable by creative directors and higher-ups. So for participants such as Rai, Claire, and Kira Kirakat, the way they express queerness through their personal artworks is rooted in their personal experiences as LGBTQ plus individuals. So to give context, we attached their artworks, their personal artworks, to demonstrate how they express their queerness. Here we have figure 3, Rai's artwork, that with the caption Paglalambing. For Ryer, he expresses queerness and even pagka-Pinoy as a way to express his creative sensibilities rooted as a gay Filipino man. And Claire, on the other hand, expresses femininity as a way to portray female agency and femininity as a trans woman. And for Kira Kirakat, on the other hand, she expresses queerness as a way to normalize the existence of queer people.
Overall, being queer should not matter as a video game developer. It seems contradictory at first, but all of our participants reiterate this idea that ultimately it's the work you do and what you bring to the table that should matter as game devs. Quality work should matter over distinctions of gender or sexual identity, and this aspect Adi themselves name as gender blindness is among the reasons why queer people are attracted to the industry. But in reality, being queer is made to be to distinctly matter due to the inseparability of context, of industry and production being rooted to the social cultural realities of the world and the Philippines. For better and for worse, queerness is treated distinctly as a big deal, be it to show consideration to or to discriminate against the queer. As Adi questions, if you're a human being, you wouldn't even have this distinction, right? This sentiment is what shapes the goal of queering, to shift it from heightening distinction into normalizing queerness instead. The participants themselves don't really aspire towards alternate ways of living or being, unlike what we first thought in our framework. Rather, they still strive to achieve the same goal of success as any other video game developer: higher positions, making indie studios, making more money, so that they can show, queer or not, they too can succeed in this industry. Radical change in thinking and treatment is not the baseline that the participants ask of themselves and of others. Queering is to assert that rather than a queer identity requiring distinction, it should be treated normally, be regarded with the same level of respect and human dignity as as normative gender and sexual identities. Queering that can be done by anyone, regardless of identity, queer or not. This manner of queering still draws from the essence of queer theory, as in order to normalize, you problematize discriminatory constructs and deconstruct hegemonic normals. Queering can thus be performed by anyone, queer or not, and can be magnified further when done by the LGBTQ+. But it must be recognized that when the LGBTQ+ queer themselves, it can also place them into a magnified position of survival when trying to assert their normalization. Precarity is further heightened by the queer performing queering themselves, as seen in social isolation, job opportunity loss, and discrimination. Claire, who identifies as a trans woman, describes her passable trans privilege or passing as a normative woman as vital to her survival, which overt assertions of queering can compromise. As such, queer coding is a preferred form of resistance, as it is an intrinsically subversive form of normalization. But once again, this subversion does not determine that they are attempting towards alternate ways of lives or goals simply because they are queer. Being queer is not an all-defining identity, as much as it may be treated as so. Queer acceptance is progressing, but still far from its ideal or realistic reality. Over time, the participants have seen significant transitions from tolerance to acceptance and absence to representation, and in an industry that's comparatively more open to queerness than any other corporate structures, as the participants themselves say. However, these participants have similarly realized that the limitations of queerness, especially in its idealism towards reality. Some struggle to visualize a realistic, inclusive reality, never mind the ideal. They do agree, however, on three qualities that for them are realistic, which is representing grounded subtle queer stories, giving players a choice for being LGBTQ+, and open, quote-unquote, gender-blind, according to Adi, workplaces. By placing normalization at the forefront of its purpose, queerness and queering can become actionable by anyone for the future, be it by mere everyday motivations and actions, or by a myriad of identities. The future of queerness and queering cannot be led by just the LGBTQ+ in the industry, realistically speaking, after all. Opening collaboration with allies, corporations, and workplaces is what can affect effective queering for the future of the industry.
Oh my God. To conclude, LGBTQ+ game devs balance between resisting mistreatment and marginalization with subversive expressions of queerness. The devs, by emphasizing the point that normalizing queer perspective or queerness as something that should be done by everyone, can hopefully lead to a more inclusive society. A few recommendations that we have are for future studies to study the wider Philippine context of game production as a whole, to hopefully remedy the lack of participants, and studies on other demographics, especially women, or other jobs such as programmers, middle management, etc., etc. Policy-wise, having inclusive work practices and anti-discriminatory policies that normalize rather than heighten queerness is the goal as set by our developers. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you had a good day.
Thank you very much, Francis, Ethan, and Audrey. Luckily, the group has 3 examiners or panelists, namely Dr. Jozon A. Lorenzana, Ms. Jessica Sandra Claudio, and Mr. George Peter Lorenzana. So we begin the interpellation with Ms. Jess.
Okay, so first of all, congratulations again. Siguro, what I liked about your manuscript is there's a definition of terms given na medyo conceptually, theoretically rich yung present yung data. But my suggestion would be also to cite your sources for certain definitions because some meron citation, but the rest seem parang normal na to, ito yung definition niya. Pero in reality, parang meron sana kayong one citation for especially gender-related concepts. So yun lang. And then in terms of research question, kasi it seems that like you have one research question and then there are sub-questions. So parang I was wondering if you can present it as the 3 sub-questions should be the 3 research questions instead of like sub-questions of your main question. No? Yung sa conceptual framework ninyo, I think you might need to, if you have it on your slide, no, you might need to, and with your thesis advisors as well, parang you might need, my suggestion is to show how the concepts are related. Kasi as of now, the illustration doesn't seem to show the relationship. So parang while you might be able to explain each, like halimbawa, hegemony, this is what it means. Ano ba, yung sa labor, ito yung ibig sabihin. Sa hegemony, sa identity, ito yung ibig sabihin. Parang how do they relate together? Which you do naman kasi in your findings and analysis. So parang para lang merong template, quote-unquote, yung thematic analysis ninyo. Show it also in your conceptual framework para madaling makita ni reader, no? And also where queerness is situated, kasi in your illustration nasa baba siya, 'di ba? But it's also part of the identity shape in your conceptual framework, no? So yun. So parang maybe revisit the way you present, parang hindi naman to change anything but just to show how each concept is related to each other. Siguro sa methodology, baka did you also capture yung age nila and also number of years working in the industry, video game industry?
Not necessarily the age, but the time working in the industry. We did ask that directly.
Ayun. Baka kasi parang material then in your analysis later on in terms of their perspective. Maybe the older ones have a different perspective when it comes to yung queerness and queer coding, 'di ba? Versus the younger participants or those who are young in the industry, quote unquote. Parang baka mas may makita kayong nuance doon. And also to edit your methodology para hindi siya future tense kasi tapos nyo na yung study. Yung sa kasi I think in your presentation now it's clearer, but in the manuscript there might be a need to make kasi you have a lot of themes, but there might be a need to parang structure it so that it's smooth in a narrative way. Parang you segue from one theme to another in a smoother way. So that may involve also recategorizing your themes. Kasi here I think you have it, diba? Parang you have a main theme and these are the sub-themes under it. So baka you can also do that for your manuscript. Kasi parang napansin ko halimbawa in the manuscript, the first few themes are very related to work situations alone. Tapos the middle part are related to, may gender component na, may queerness related na. And then the last part, sobrang lakas nung about queer coding and queerness, diba? So parang para lang to make sure that the intersections as seen in your conceptual framework are consistent all throughout your findings. Baka pwede nyong i-restructure yung ano nyo. Ang na-interest ako kasi parang wala kasi ako nung the proposal defense. So parang my question would be parang why the specific attention to the video game industry? And I ask it because it seems in your findings there's only a small section of it that pertains to the video game industry. So parang, yes, you have discussions about workplaces and the precarity of work, diba, yung experience nila within their respective workplaces. Pero specifically about being video game, producers, diba? Developers pala, medyo manipis yung part na yon. So parang I was wondering if parang in the design of the study, could it have been, people from creative industries in general instead of the video game industry? So maybe you have a rationale for the video game. Yeah.
I think one main factor to that would be a majority. Well, when it came to arriving at how we arrived at video game industry, it's because when we noticed at first that in terms of studies in at least locally, there's a lot of studies about player and audience interpretation. But when it came to the the production side, we only found one symposium, which was 2 pages, and it didn't really have anything specific. So you wanted to delve into that. As for why the thesis may have appeared more related to the creative industry, I think it's because 3 out of the 5 participants were artists, and artists, their work while they do specific work within the video game industry, such as with UI UX or with character and game assets, they also do art for what do you call that? Commissions, portfolios, and that may have been mixed into the data as well.
Yeah, kasi yun yung, baka pwede yung explicitly mention that. Kasi parang the title itself and the methodology section makes it seem that it's just about the video game industry. Pero meron kasing layer na meron silang ibang like passion projects that are also creative. So, yun yung, tsaka parang the discussion on work is all about work. Pero also, you need to maybe explain na yung the side of creative labor which they are part of, no. I think also one of the questions that you need to answer, maybe not now but maybe in the manuscript, is whether you think queer coding is empowering or not. Kasi parang the explanations fluctuate throughout the manuscript. Kasi parang you're saying na it's a way to negotiate their identities in the workplace. So no, in a sense, but it's also parang how they put their presence out there. So parang yes. But at the same time, parang you're also saying, di ba yung shifting from distinction to normalization? So meron ding tensions doon. Kasi nga parang, you mentioned gender blindness a while ago. So do you mean that normalization, parang normalizing queerness means what exactly? Parang, kasi you mentioned also in your manuscript na contradictory siya, kasi for you to be able to normalize queerness, you need to heighten the distinctions. So parang yung tensions doon yung I feel are really interesting if you could expound on it further and use also consistently throughout your themes the narratives and the voices of your interviewees. Because there are themes na merong transcripts and there are themes na wala. So nawawala yung boses niya. So yun lang on my end. Sorry, tatlo yung panelists.
Thank you very much, Miss Jess. Yeah, and congratulations for fulfilling multiple roles for the conference. The next to comment is Dr. Anjo, who's joining through Zoom.
Right.
Yeah, there she is, the alluring Dr. Anjo.
Hello. Sorry. Yeah, I can't be present because I have another Zoom meeting. Right. Yeah, I actually followed the thesis, right, from the beginning. So I know the journey of this group, and I'm quite delighted that they have moved from the very theoretical plane, you know. They're quite imaginative at the start. So we needed to ground them. And so this is quite an achievement that finally the material shows their very deep engagement with their informants. And I totally agree with Jessie's comments, because that's really how you're going to organize the work. I mean, 100%, okay? So my concern now is, actually the implications of your argument. First, what is your main argument? I think you need to articulate that, right? Okay. And next, okay, after your main argument is articulated, I want to know more about the implications of your findings. You know, what does it mean for queer workers in the game industry if, okay, they are able to navigate, the terrain, as well as there's also the possibility that for them, okay, they may not successfully, negotiate, the terms of their employment, given, for instance, the gender biases in the workplace. Okay, so now I'm saying this in the context of, production, right? So two of you actually were my students in the anthropology of media. And we have a module on, right, labor in the context of media industries. Okay, so I want you to review your notes, okay? What exactly are the challenges, okay, since time immemorial, okay, in the creative industries, okay? So, your work actually speaks to that kind of literature, right? And in fact, in the previous presentation, I was able to follow the presentation of, the group on female basketball players. There's also a question there on the media. I think it has something to do as well with the political economy of media in general, right? Okay. So, but the political economy of media here, especially in relation to the work of Ethan, Audrey, and Francis, really has to do with, you know, um, the terms of the conditions of labor, right? So I think that's a really good point for reflection, especially in your concluding chapter. Yeah. So after Jesse has after you implement Jesse's recommendations, then I think you're ready to talk about how your findings actually speak to issues of labor in the creative industries. So I thought that's the way to go for your thesis. Congratulations.
Thank you so much po.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anjo. So the last to comment is Mr. George Peter Lorenzana, who's also joining via Zoom.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Can I be heard? Yay, hello. First, I want to congratulate the group for completing their paper and presentation. I know it's not easy, even working as a group to work on this particular project. Actually, a lot of the things that I had on my mind was already asked a while ago already regarding how the paper can be improved further. I just have a few questions and I guess a few suggestions to add on top of that. I just want to clarify the part wherein in the presentation in the paper as well, something was mentioned about like gender shouldn't matter, right? Can you clarify was the goal to emphasize that yes, since your participants mentioned that it shouldn't matter in terms of their work, you agree with it, or you're saying that no, it actually does matter?
To clarify that, the ideal is that gender should not matter, as in it should not be treated differently than any other identity, but because the reality of it is that it is not just by the participants but by people surrounding them and the conditions surrounding them, then they have to then in that aspect it is like a yes and no answer, where ideally it should not matter, but realistically it does, and the participants have to navigate that reality and their efforts and aspirations towards making that reality closer to the ideal.
Siguro to add in, tsaka may ano din siya, like layers on, as said, the male gaze and the hegemonic masculinity. So parang in an ideal world, ano po sana, parang gender is not something that should be deterministic or something na should have been mattered, especially along the production of games. But since there is a standard, a normative standard when it comes to the production of games, parang ayun nga po, nagkakaroon siya ng implication or ayun, parang ostracization nga po when it comes to queer identities. That's why, as said earlier by Audrey, it does become matter in the long run. Kaya parang ayun po, nagiging tug of war po, tension po na nangyayari when it comes to being queer within the industry.
Okay, sige. So I think that's my first suggestion, which is to determine where you stand in terms of that particular idea. Like, I think you have to decide, like, if this paper is supposed to be improved and developed further, like, you kind of have to decide whether it does or doesn't matter. And the best parallel I can give you about, this gender matter is the same argument that people have when it comes to another marker of identity, which is race. So if you're familiar with, recent history, in the same manner that other people argue that race shouldn't matter, and some people argue that race does matter. And perhaps that's something that you could research on and see what the parallels are when it comes to the marker of identity in terms of gender. The next is just to clarify, and this was actually mentioned a while ago as well. So to clarify, the paper is more about the industry and people within the industry as opposed to games that are produced. Would that be correct?
Yes po, pero I guess in some way or another po kasi, like, when it comes to discussing the industry, it also becomes becomes also relevant in discussing kung ano po yung games na napoproduce nila along the way. That's why we also included parang excerpts po on their how they express queerness via their art, kasi ayun nga po, it's something that indicates yung parang experiences nila within the industry and also how it reflects throughout their craft. So parang yes, it's a focus within the industry, but we also want to take it din po na we want to consider somehow or in some way or another how the actual product of the game is like po within the video game that they produce.
Okay. So I guess the reason for that question is something to think about when you're reviewing your paper would be to ask the question of, is this thing that's being communicated specifically about gender and connected to the issue of gender? Or, for example, is it a corporate issue thing, a corporate culture thing? Because you did identify that the major driver in terms of production would be profit, right? And since you did mention as part of your theoretical framework ideas coming from basically Marxist theory, neo-Marxist, etc., also related to the stuff that you should be familiar with since you were my students, we talk about ideas such as ideology and mythologies, right? So the question becomes, is this specifically about gender or is this specifically about production? Because if it's about production rather than gender, at least at the beginning, right? I think one of the missing aspects in the paper is because your data is primarily from anecdotes, from stories narrated by your participants. I don't remember encountering something that was more like an insertion of the demographic within the industry, right? Meaning, for example, as an industry, the video games industry, like the demographic in terms of how many are actually run by men, how many are employed in that industry, how many of those are occupied by positions of power, and men are the ones deciding what to do. Like one of your participants, like Kira, right? Like talks about something about the way that I think like breasts are supposed to be depicted in terms of like design, and then there's a dispute between her and the client regarding that. So by contextualizing that much of the industry is still very much run by men, so people that are in positions of power happen to be men, whether or not they intentionally do so, they are reproducing ideas that are reflective of their own worldview or their experiences. And so there's this tension between your participants and then the industry that they're a part of. I think that might be something that could make your paper richer because it contextualizes that it's not just about these people and their individual experiences. It's a pattern, and then you can sort of prove that pattern because there is an industry-wide systemic thing. Since your paper did mention something about the system and about the structures of power, right? So that when you can reconcile that. And then the last question I think I have would be regarding representation, because some of your participants talk about representation and queering their product, queering their work essentially, and sometimes queer coding it in such a way that's not overt, and then it might get passed by the review of their clients or whoever is going to decide whether that goes into the final product. My question has to do with the idea of when they are queer coding, when they are performing that, two things actually. One, does the end product or does the video game, for example, or whatever part of video game it is that they're working on, does it specifically have to be queered? Like, meaning, does the product need it, ask for it, or is it better because of it? That's number one. Number two is the way that queering happens. Do they queer it in such a way that is specifically, how do I put it? It's meaning it's better for its own sake, or is it rather a tokenized version? Meaning, I have the same discussion with another, like a close friend of mine, which is when people do a work of art and the work of art happens to be performed or created by a person who is queer, are we supposed to read it as a queer work of art, meaning it's an artwork that is queer because by virtue of the creator being it queer, right? Or the reverse, which is, or not exactly the reverse, but the other side of that is, like, are we projecting simply our own assumptions of what queer is supposed to be, and therefore the artist simply responds to something that you will recognize as queer and reproduces that idea. The point being that the performance of queer happens to be for the benefit of the a heteronormative public. Does that make sense? Rather than being queer for its own sake, for its own terms. So those are my two questions. And then those are like my last questions for the group.
Sa first question po regarding does it have to be queered, like representation, ayun po. I think with regards at least from the participants, they do it in a way po kasi na as said nga po earlier, they are trying to normalize queerness or their existence po as LGBTQ plus individuals, and maybe it also transcends to the fact nga na they are not able to overtly express queerness, and so they try to negotiate other ways to do it. And so maybe in a parang I would like to ask din siguro dun sa parang question po, parang paano ba? Sorry. Yung does it have to be in the first place, male gaze in the first place po, parang ganun, like how games are produced, does it have to be catered towards the male gaze? Kasi ayun po, as we said earlier then, there's a ongoing parang nagiging wide po yung audiences when it comes to the video game audience. And so ayun po, parang nagkakaroon siya ng implications when it comes to stories and representations that are needed to be produced. So parang maybe it does need to be subversive para magkaroon po ng ayun po representation to other communities as well.
To add on to that, I think to answer the question of does the end product need specifically have to be queered, it goes back to one of our previous discussions, which is a story worth telling. Is for some games specific for depending on the intentions of the producers and the companies, they may, when they intend to have the end product queered, they have to it's a matter of deliberation of not just their own artistic desire, but also of considering the market, where the trends also need to speak, and also not just the trends, but also accepting the backlash or the consequences of those trends, both good and bad. So in a way, the end product does not specifically need to be queered. It just depends on what the company determines as a part of the story that they should be telling in their games. Second question.
Yeah, before you respond to the second question, I think, my suggestion is you can add your thoughts regarding that first question with what I suggested a while ago. It was what has been pointed out before, which is try to contextualize your narrative, your paper with an understanding and recognition of the industry that you're talking about. Have you added that again? Much of the industry is still much dominated by men, and marketing still is geared towards the assumption that most gamers happen to be men as well, right? There is this connection between, assumption of your market, the product being produced, and how the production process happens, and then the end product being shipped out, and then the anticipation that it's still the same audience that will be playing your game, right? And then, of course, that's where the clearing question comes in, which is, when if your argument is basically that the people working within games are not, are changing. It's not primarily men anymore. There are people now that are coming from a more diverse background. Um, then queering is a form of, as mentioned, subversive as a form of resistance, and that's a theme that perhaps you can work on. And then my final question, in case you forgot, is about the question of representation, actually. That idea of, is it token representation or not?
Regarding the question of when queering happens, is it better for its own sake or its own tokenized discussion? Again, I think, it falls back in a way to the intention and also the conditions behind it, because there are some games do, what do you call it? Both forms of querying do happen, where it's both for its own sake and also as a way of being tokenized. I would, yes, I would suppose that is the response, where it sort of depends on who is performing the querying and the intention behind it, and what is the end result as well, and also in part what is the receival of that.
Also, to add into it, I guess, to recap then on what Francis had said earlier, it also comes back to the idea that profitability or profit is the main lifeline po of the industry in itself. So parang, in a way, ayun po, it happens na queer representation is also being commodified in a way, both covert and overtly. And with regards to the question na parang, does it have to be virtue of interpretation ng audiences or virtue of interpretation of the artist, kung alin pong level, I think, it sort of depends, and again, it's also parang observable nga po on how there's parang tag nga po, or tension, kasi po, the fact na it's being covertly expressed, and so parang hindi po siya gaano nahalata even with male audiences or heterosexuals. But then, when the same queer-coded material is presented towards queer people or women, parang they also find parang clues or hints nga po that add or that imply that it could be queer. And so, to answer that question, I guess it's both and equally valid in a sense na parang, ayun nga po, in a sense na the artists themselves, they try to queer the characters that they are designing or even the games that they are producing. It's valid din po na, and it's also valid din po na to also receive it from the audience, whether intentional man na queer coded ba yun or hindi man. To answer the question po.
Oh, thank you. So, my last suggestion is just review Audrey would know this, Miss Male character that I showed you in class. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. George Peter Lorenzana. And thank you to our presenters, Audrey, Francis, and Ethan. So we conclude, because we exceeded an hour, so we conclude this year's conference by expressing gratitude to all the presenters, supervisors, panelists, organizers, and the attendees from both online and on-site. So congratulations and many thanks And we wish to see everybody next year. Have a good day. Next, I mean, not to the rest, not the presenters, okay? The attendees, I mean. So, there. So, you should graduate in July. Is it July or June? June. Sige.